I never thought the man who taught me to ride a bike would be the same man trying to steal my home. But there I was, sitting in a cold courtroom watching my father, the person who was supposed to protect me, argue that I had no legal right to stay in the $1.2 million house I bought with my own money. The house I invited him into when he had nowhere to go after his divorce. His girlfriend Melissa sat beside him, her manicured nails tapping the table, her smile sharp as a knife. She'd been living in my house for 3 months, slowly taking over, quietly erasing me. And now they wanted it all. My father's attorney slid a document across the judge's bench, a deed transfer with my signature on it. Except I'd never signed anything. I was in Boston the day that paper was supposedly notarized. The courtroom felt too small, too hot. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears as my father leaned back in his chair, confident, almost bored. Then the judge picked up the document. She studied it for what felt like an eternity. And when she finally looked up, her eyes locked on my father with an expression that made my breath catch. She asked one question, just one, that turned his smug smile into pure panic. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they had been planning your destruction all along? My name is Paige Warren. I'm 38 years old, a senior project manager at a tech firm in Silicon Valley, and for most of my life, I've been invisible. Not literally, of course, but in all the ways that matter, especially to the people who are supposed to love me most. The courtroom that day was just the final act in a lifelong pattern I should have recognized years ago. But to understand how I ended up fighting my own father in front of a judge, you need to know where it all started. You need to know about the invisible daughter I'd always been. I was 7 years old the first time I realized my father had a favorite child, and it wasn't me. My brother Tyler had broken Mum's favorite vase, playing baseball in the house, something we were explicitly forbidden to do. I'd been reading quietly in the corner as usual when the crash happened. Tyler immediately pointed at me and said I'd pushed him. It was a lie, and we both knew it. But when Dad came storming in, he didn't ask questions. He just looked at me with those disappointed eyes and said, "Paige, I expected better from you." I tried to explain, tried to tell the truth, but Tyler was already crying and Dad was already comforting him, and my words just dissolved into the air like they'd never been spoken at all. That became the pattern. Tyler broke things, forgot things, failed things, and somehow I was always the one who should have known better, should have tried harder, should have been more responsible. Mum saw it. I know she did. Sometimes I'd catch her watching Dad praise Tyler for mediocre report cards while barely glancing at my straight A's, and I'd see something like sadness flicker across her face. She'd pull me aside later, stroke my hair, and whisper, "You're stronger than you know, sweetheart. Someday you'll need that strength." I was 12 when she left. No dramatic exit, no big confrontation, just a note on the kitchen table one Tuesday morning that said she couldn't do this anymore. Dad told everyone she'd abandoned us, made her sound selfish and cruel. But I found her real letter, hidden in my pillowcase that night. "My darling girl," it read, "I'm not strong enough to stay in a house where I'm slowly disappearing. But you have steel in your spine, even if you don't know it yet. Take care of the rose garden for me. When the white roses bloom, I'll be with you, I promise." The rose garden became my refuge. Every day after school, I'd sit among those bushes, pulling weeds, watering carefully, talking to Mum like she could hear me. The white roses she'd planted before she left became my connection to her, the only person who'd ever really seen me. Dad withdrew after Mum left, but his favoritism toward Tyler only intensified. It was like he needed someone to pour all his attention into, and I simply wasn't worth the effort. Tyler got driving lessons and college fund contributions. I got lectures about self-sufficiency and criticism disguised as concern. So I learned to stop asking, stop expecting, stop being hurt every time I was overlooked. I threw myself into school, then into my career. I worked late, volunteered for the hardest projects, climbed the corporate ladder, one invisible rung at a time. I bought my own car, my own furniture, eventually, my own house, a beautiful $1.2 million home with a backyard perfect for a rose garden. I never bragged about my success, never called Dad to share my wins. I'd learned that lesson long ago. Asking for validation only sets you up for disappointment. I didn't know that staying silent would nearly cost me everything I'd built. At 38, I'd finally built something that was entirely mine. The house sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in Palo Alto, a charming craftsman. Our years old home with original hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and exactly the kind of backyard I dreamed about since childhood. When the real estate agent first showed it to me, I'd walked straight through the house to the back door, and the moment I saw that southern exposure with rich soil and established garden beds, I knew this was it. This was where I'd bring Mum's roses back to life. I'd worked 15 years to get here, starting as a junior analyst fresh out of state college, living in a studio apartment with furniture from Goodwill, eating ramen 4 nights a week, while my peers, who came from money, went out for sushi and craft cocktails. I worked weekends. I learned to code on my own time. I took on the projects no one else wanted and delivered them flawlessly. Slowly, invisibly, I climbed. When I finally signed the closing papers on the house, I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes just staring at it. My house. No roommates, no landlord, no one to tell me I couldn't paint the walls or plant a garden or stay up until 3 a.m. reading, if I wanted to. I called Tyler to share the news, thinking maybe this achievement would finally earn me some recognition. He said, "That's cool," and then spent 20 minutes telling me about his new motorcycle. I didn't bother calling Dad. The first thing I did after moving in was restore the backyard. I spent entire weekends digging out weeds, amending the soil, building raised beds. I ordered white rose bushes from the same nursery Mum had used. I'd kept the receipt she'd tucked into her gardening journal all these years. David Austin roses specifically, the variety called Winchester Cathedral. When they arrived, bare root that first spring, I planted them exactly where the afternoon sun would hit just right, talking to Mum the whole time like I used to when I was 12. My neighbour, Mrs. Chen, watched me work from her side of the fence for 3 days before she finally came over. She was a tiny woman in her late 70s with soil permanently under her fingernails and the kind of perceptive eyes that seemed to see straight through polite small talk. "You're Sarah's daughter," she said, not a question, a statement. I'd frozen with my trowel mid-dig. Nobody had mentioned my mother's name in years. "You knew her. We had tea every Thursday for 5 years, Mrs." Chen said, her accent still thick despite decades in America. "She talked about you constantly, showed me pictures, told me about the invisible daughter who noticed everything." She paused, looking at the rose bushes I was planting. "Winchester Cathedral. She always said when you had your own garden, you'd plant those first." Something in my chest cracked open. "She left when I was 12. "She had to," Mrs. Chen said simply. "Some houses consume you if you stay. But she made me promise if you ever came back to this neighborhood, if you ever needed someone who remembered her, I should tell you she never stopped loving you. She just couldn't stay invisible anymore." After that, Mrs. Chen and I gardened together most weekends. She never pried, never pushed me to talk, but somehow working in the soil beside someone who'd known Mum made me feel less alone. She taught me her grandmother's method for composting, and I taught her about drip irrigation systems. We rarely discussed anything deeper than nitrogen levels and aphid control, but it was the most meaningful friendship I'd had in years. For 3 years, the house was my sanctuary. I'd wake up early, have coffee on the back porch, watching the roses go to work, come home to my space where everything was exactly as I'd left it. I wasn't lonely, I was peaceful. There's a difference, though, most people don't understand it. Then Dad's second marriage imploded. He called me on a Tuesday evening, something he never did. "Your stepmother and I are getting divorced," he said without preamble. "It's been coming for a while." I made sympathetic noises, asked if he was okay, expected the call to end there. But then he said, I'm going to need to find a new place. The house was in her name. There was a long pause. I knew what he was asking without asking. This was my chance, I thought. My chance to finally build the relationship I'd always wanted. If he lived with me even temporarily, maybe he'd finally see me. See what I'd accomplished. See that I'd been worth noticing all along. I have a guest suite on the first floor, I heard myself say. Separate entrance, private bathroom. You could stay there while you figure things out. The relief in his voice was palpable. You do that, Paige, that's thank you. I won't be in your way, just until I get back on my feet. Tyler thought I was crazy. He's never been there for you, he said when I told him. Why would you do this? Because I'm still that 7-year-old trying to be good enough, I didn't say. Because maybe if he's in my home, seeing my life every day, he'll finally be proud of me. Dad moved in on a Saturday in March. He was polite, almost formal, thanking me for the space and promising not to be a burden. I showed him how the coffee maker worked, gave him keys, told him to make himself at home. He looked around the house with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprised maybe that I'd done this well for myself. For the first few weeks, it was fine. Better than fine. He'd join me for dinner occasionally, and we'd have actual conversations about work and life. He even complimented my rose garden, said Mum would have been proud. Those words meant more than they should have. I let myself hope. Then, 6 weeks after Dad moved in, she walked through my door. Her name was Melissa Grant, and she was the kind of woman who knew exactly how attractive she was and exactly how to use it. Dad introduced her on a Thursday evening when I came home from work, both of them sitting on my living room couch, like it was the most natural thing in the world for him to bring guests into my home without asking. Paige, this is Melissa, Dad said, standing up with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen from him in years. We met at the gym 3 weeks ago. Melissa, this is my daughter. She rose, gracefully extending a perfectly manicured hand. I've heard so much about you, she said, her voice warm and smooth as honey. She was probably in her early 50s, 15 years younger than Dad, with highlighted blonde hair, expertly applied makeup and clothes that whispered expensive without screaming it. Your father says you're some kind of tech genius. Just a project manager, I said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, confident, but her eyes were doing something strange. They weren't looking at me. They were cataloguing, sweeping across the original artwork I'd collected over the years, lingering on the vintage Persian rug I'd found at an estate sale, pausing at the built-in shelving with its first edition books. This house is absolutely stunning, she said, finally meeting my gaze. You have exquisite taste. These floors, the crown moulding, they just don't make homes like this anymore. Something in the way she said, this house, made my shoulders tense, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was being paranoid. Dad was allowed to date. I should be happy he'd found someone. Would you like to stay for dinner? I offered, because that's what you're supposed to say. Oh, that's so sweet, but I couldn't impose. Melissa demurred, glancing at Dad with practiced timing. Unless you insist. We did not insist. But she stayed anyway. That first dinner, she was charming. She asked about my work, seemed genuinely interested in my responses, complimented the meal I'd thrown together. She told carefully edited stories about her career in real estate, mostly residential properties, helping families find their dream homes, and laughed at Dad's jokes in a way that made him sit up straighter. I watched him watching her and realised I hadn't seen my father smile like that in decades. When she left that night, Dad walked her to her car. Through the window, I saw them kiss in the driveway, and something uncomfortable twisted in my stomach. Not jealousy exactly, more like a premonition. She seems nice, I said when he came back inside, because that's what you're supposed to say. She's incredible, Dad said, and there was something almost manic in his enthusiasm. I haven't felt this way since... He stopped abruptly. Since... Mum, I finished silently. Since before Mum stopped being enough for you. Melissa's second visit was 2 days later, then 3 days after that. Then, she was there when I came home from work on Tuesday, cooking dinner in my kitchen, like she'd done it 100 times before. "I hope you don't mind," she said, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping on my cutting board. "Your father mentioned you've been working such long hours. I thought I'd help out." "That's thoughtful," I said, setting down my laptop bag and trying to ignore how it felt to have a stranger rearranging my spice cabinet to reach the paprika. By the end of that week, there was a toothbrush in the guest bathroom that wasn't Dad's, designer face cream on the counter, a silk robe hanging on the back of the door. "Melissa's lease is ending," Dad explained when I finally asked. "She needs somewhere to stay for a few weeks while she closes on her new condo. I told her she could use the spare bedroom in my suite. That's okay, isn't it?" What was I supposed to say? "No, your girlfriend can't stay in the space you're renting from me. That would make me the villain." So I nodded and said something about how a few weeks would be fine, already knowing in my gut that a few weeks would stretch and morph into something else entirely. I was right. Week 2, the condo closing got delayed due to inspection issues. Week 3, there was a problem with the title. Week 4, she stopped mentioning the condo altogether, and I stopped asking. Dad changed during those weeks. The father who'd been having actual conversations with me over dinner started responding in monosyllables, his attention always half on wherever Melissa was in the house. He stopped asking how my day was. He started saying things that sounded wrong, coming out of his mouth phrases like, "We need to maximize the natural light," and "this space has so much potential," that I recognized as pure Melissa. One Saturday, I came home from grocery shopping to find her in my rose garden. She was wielding my good pruning shears, and there were branches everywhere, piles of them scattered across the lawn. My Winchester Cathedral roses, the ones I'd nurtured for 3 years, had been hacked back to stumps. "Melissa, what are you doing?" I tried to keep my voice level, but it came out strangled. She turned, smiling brightly. "Oh, good, you're home. I was just helping with the garden. These roses were so overgrown, they really needed a hard pruning. I used to help my grandmother with her garden, so I know what I'm doing." "Those roses bloom on old wood," I said, staring at the destruction. "They needed selective pruning, not this. You've cut off all the flowering canes." "Oh." She tilted her head, managing to look both apologetic and unconcerned. "Well, they'll grow back stronger. Sometimes things need to be cut down to the root to really thrive, you know." Mrs. Chen was watching from her side of the fence, her face carefully neutral, but I caught the warning in her eyes. That night I found Dad and told him Melissa couldn't touch my garden anymore. He got defensive in a way that shocked me. "She was just trying to help. You're being ungrateful. Do you know how lucky you are that she's even willing to put this much effort into your property?" "Your property, not my property. Your property." I let it go because I didn't want to fight, because I'd spent my whole life avoiding conflict with him, because I still stupidly hoped we could salvage something. By week 3, I found her measuring my bedroom windows. She was standing in the doorway of my bedroom with a tape measure in her hand, stretching it across the window frame and jotting numbers down in a small notebook. My bedroom. The one space in the house I'd explicitly told both her and Dad was off limits. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Melissa didn't even startle. She just turned with that placid smile and said, "Oh, I was thinking these windows would look so much better with plantation shutters. The blinds you have are a little dated. Don't you think I know a guy who does custom work at a great price?" "I like my blinds," I said flatly. "And I didn't ask for decorating advice." She tilted her head, and for just a fraction of a second, something cold flickered behind her eyes. Then the warm smile was back. "Of course. I was just trying to help. Your father mentioned you're so busy with work, you barely have time to think about home improvements." I wanted to tell her to get out, to tell her this was my house, my bedroom, my life. But Dad was standing behind her in the hallway, and the look on his face stopped me cold. He looked disappointed, in me again. That was 6 weeks into Melissa's temporary stay. By week 7, I stopped counting the days until she'd leave and started documenting the invasions instead. I'd been in Chicago for 4 days on a business trip leading a critical client presentation that could make or break my next promotion. The project consumed every waking hour and I barely had time to check my personal email, let alone worry about what was happening back home. When I finally walked through my front door on Friday evening, exhausted and ready to collapse, I found a stack of mail on the kitchen counter that made my stomach drop. The electric bill was addressed to Robert Warren. So was the water bill. And the gas bill. I pulled out my phone and checked my bank account. No automatic payments had gone through. These utilities had been switched entirely out of my name. "Dad," I called out, my voice tight. "Can you come here, please?" He emerged from his suite, with Melissa right behind him, like they were a single unit now. "What's wrong?" I held up the bills. "Why are these in your name?" "Oh, that." He waved a hand dismissively. "Melissa handled it while you were gone. She thought it would be easier. Since I'm living here, I should contribute to the household expenses. It's only fair." "I didn't ask you to contribute," I said slowly, "and I certainly didn't authorize anyone to change my utility accounts." Melissa stepped forward, her voice syrupy with concern. "I'm so sorry if I overstepped. I just saw how stressed you were before your trip, and I wanted to help lighten your load. Your father and I talked about it, and we thought it would be a nice surprise taking one more thing off your plate." By removing my name from my own utility bills. "Well, they're still for the house," she said, as if I were being unreasonable. "Does it really matter whose name is on them? Your father is paying them now, so actually you should be thanking us." The logic was so twisted I couldn't immediately find words to counter it. And in that pause, Dad said, "She's right, Paige. You're being ungrateful. Melissa spent hours on hold with those companies doing you a favour." I changed the utilities back the next day, sitting on hold for 90 minutes with each company providing proof of ownership, my ID, my mortgage statements. The customer service representatives kept asking why my father had been able to make the changes in the first place. I didn't have a good answer. That same week, a plumber came to fix a leak under the kitchen sink. I'd called him, scheduled the appointment, and planned to be home for it. But I got caught in a meeting that ran over, and when I finally made it home, the plumber was just finishing up. He handed me the bill, then said, "The lady of the house already approved everything. She showed me a few other things that might need attention too." "The lady of the house," I repeated. He gestured vaguely toward the hallway. "The blonde woman. She said she manages the property." I found Melissa in what used to be my home office, rearranging my bookshelves. "The plumber said you told him you managed this property." "Oh, did I say that? I probably just meant that I'm helping your father manage his space here. You know how men are. They never think about maintenance issues." She laughed lightly. "I was just trying to be helpful." The HOA letter arrived 3 days later, addressed to Mr. Robert Warren at my address. It was about some proposed changes to the neighbourhood landscaping requirements. I'd been on the HOA email list for 3 years, receiving every notice. Suddenly, they were addressing correspondence to my father. I called the HOA president, a woman named Sandra I'd chatted with at neighbourhood events. "Sandra, why is my father receiving HOA mail? He doesn't own this property." There was a confused pause. "Oh, I'm so sorry. A woman called last month, Melissa, I think, and said she was handling property management for the Warren residence. She asked us to update the contact information. I assumed she was your property manager or assistant." "She's my father's girlfriend," I said through clenched teeth. "She has no authority over my property." "Oh dear, I'll fix that right away." But the damage was already done. Melissa was systematically inserting herself into every system, every contact, every aspect of my home's administration. She was erasing me from my own life, and she was doing it with a smile and a helpful explanation every single time. The jewelry box disappeared on a Tuesday. I kept it on my dresser, a small wooden box Mum had given me when I was 10, containing a few pieces of her costume jewellery she'd left behind. Nothing valuable in monetary terms, but priceless to me. When I noticed it was gone, I searched my entire room, then the whole house. "Melissa, have you seen a small wooden jewellery box? It was on my dresser." She looked up from her phone with that practiced expression of concern. "A jewellery box?" "No, I haven't seen one. Are you sure you didn't pack it away somewhere? Maybe during spring cleaning? You do seem very distracted lately. Maybe you misplaced it." I hadn't done any spring cleaning, and I sure as hell wouldn't have misplaced one of the few physical items I had from my mother. That weekend, I checked on the rose garden and found the Winchester cathedrals looking worse than they had after Melissa's brutal pruning. The leaves were yellowing, the new growth stunted and weak. "Mrs." Chen was in her garden and called over, "Did you change your watering schedule?" "No, why? I've been watching. Someone's watering them in the afternoon now when the sun is strongest, and too much the soil is staying wet. Roses need deep watering in the morning, then time to dry." I didn't have to ask who. I found the timer on my irrigation system had been completely reprogrammed. When I confronted Melissa, she said, "Oh, I just thought it would be more efficient to water everything at once in the afternoon. Saves water, you know I'm very environmentally conscious." "You're killing them," I said. "Don't be so dramatic. They're just plants. They'll adapt." But they weren't just plants. They were my mother. They were my connection to the one person who'd ever really seen me. And Melissa was drowning them. Week 8, I came home to find an envelope on my pillow. My hand shook as I picked it up. The envelope was thick, official looking, with my name typed across the front in formal business font. I sat down on the edge of my bed, the bed I'd chosen in the house I'd bought in the room that was supposed to be my private sanctuary, and opened it. "Notice to vacate premises" was printed in bold letters across the top of the document inside. I read it once, then again, then a third time because my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. "You are hereby notified that you must vacate the property located at 847 Maple Grove Drive, Palo Alto, California, within 30 days of receipt of this notice. This action is being taken due to family restructuring needs and reallocation of property resources. Failure to comply will result in formal eviction proceedings." It was signed by my father. My father was evicting me from my own house. The paper slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the floor. I sat there staring at nothing, my mind reeling. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding. Maybe it was a joke, though Dad had never been one for humour. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch with Melissa beside him. They weren't watching TV or reading or doing anything in particular, just sitting there like they'd been waiting for me. The way Melissa's hand rested on Dad's knee, the way she looked at me with something that might have been pity but felt more like triumph, I knew immediately this was no mistake. "What is this?" I held up the notice, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. Dad stood up, his face set in that expression I knew from childhood, the one that meant his mind was made up and arguing was pointless. "Exactly what it says. Melissa and I have been talking, and we think it's time for you to find your own place." "My own place?" I stared at him. "Dad, this is my place. This is my house. I bought it. The mortgage is in my name. You're living here because I invited you to stay." "That's not entirely accurate," Melissa interjected, her voice gentle and reasonable, like she was explaining something to a confused child. "Your father has been contributing to the household, helping with expenses. He has just as much right to be here as you do." "No," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "No, he doesn't. This house is titled solely in my name. I have the deed. I've been paying the mortgage for 3 years. He's been here for 8 weeks. Dad's jaw tightened. "Paige, you're 38 years old. It's time to learn independence and stop relying on family property. Melissa and I need space to build our life together. And frankly, This house is more suitable for our needs than for a single woman who's barely here anyway. The words hit me like a physical blow. Family property. As if I were the child living in his house instead of the other way around. As if the 15 years I'd worked, the money I'd saved, the mortgage payments I'd made, as if none of it mattered. Stop relying on family property. I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts. Dad, this isn't family property. This is my property. I earned this. I bought this. You don't have any legal right to ask me to leave. Actually, he said, reaching into a folder on the coffee table. I do. He pulled out a stack of papers and handed them to me. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped them. They were property deed transfer documents, official county forms, and there on the signature line was my name. My signature. Dated March 15th, 3 weeks ago when I'd been in Boston for that critical client presentation. According to these documents, I had voluntarily transferred 50% ownership of my house to my father. This is insane, I whispered, flipping through the pages. I never signed this. I've never even seen these forms before. You signed them the week before your Chicago trip, Dad said, and his voice had that patient, patronizing tone he'd used when I was 7 and trying to tell him Tyler broke the vase. We discussed it. You said you wanted to make me feel more secure here, more like it was really my home too. You agreed that co-ownership made sense. That never happened, my voice cracked. Dad, I was in Boston on March 15th. I have plane tickets, hotel receipts, client meeting records. The document is notarized, Melissa said softly, pointing to the official stamp at the bottom of the page. See, a notary public witnessed your signature. Everything was done legally. I stared at the notary seal. It looked real. Everything looked real. The paper stock, the county recorder's stamp, the formatting, it was all legitimate. Except for one impossible problem. I had never signed it. I studied my signature on the document. The way the P in Page swooped the particular way the W in Warren connected to the A, it looked exactly like my handwriting. But I knew with absolute certainty that I had never put pen to that paper. This is fraud, I said, my voice hollow. Someone forged my signature. Dad's expression hardened. That's a serious accusation, Paige. Are you really going to stand there and call your own father a criminal after everything I've done for you? After I raised you, put food on your table, kept a roof over your head? You mean the roof Mum paid for with her job while you criticised everything she did? The words were out before I could stop them. Years of resentment bubbling to the surface. The food she cooked while you told her it wasn't seasoned, right? The home she tried to make while you acted like she was never enough. Don't you dare bring your mother into this. Dad snapped, his face flushing red. She abandoned us. She gave up. And here you are, 30 years later, making the same kind of wild accusations and creating the same kind of drama. Robert? Melissa interrupted gently, placing a hand on his arm. Let's all take a breath. Paige is clearly very upset and confused. Maybe she doesn't remember signing the papers. She's been under so much stress at work. Sometimes our memories aren't as reliable as we think. She was gaslighting me, right to my face, with my father nodding along like everything she said made perfect sense. I want you to leave, I said, my voice shaking. Both of you, get out of my house. Legally, we don't have to, Dad said, tapping the forged documents. I own half of this property now, and as co-owner, I'm exercising my right to request that you vacate within 30 days. If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to pursue formal eviction through the courts. Then pursue it, I said, my shock crystallizing into cold fury, because I'm not going anywhere, and I'm going to prove that signature is fake. Good luck with that, Melissa said, and for just a second her mask slipped. The warmth was gone from her eyes, replaced by something calculating and hard. Everything was done legally, with proper documentation and witnesses. But If you want to waste money on lawyers and make this harder on everyone, that's your choice. I looked at my father, really looked at him, searching for any sign of the man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd read me bedtime stories when I was small, who'd once been someone I wanted to make proud. But that man was gone if he'd ever really existed. In his place was a stranger wearing my father's face, a stranger who was trying to steal everything I'd built. That signature looked exactly like mine, but I'd never seen these papers before in my life. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until 3 a.m. with the deed transfer documents spread out in front of me, studying every line, every word, every stroke of that signature. The more I looked at it, the more certain I became this wasn't mine. The shape was right, the flow was right, but something about it was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. It was like looking at a photograph of yourself where the proportions are slightly off, and your brain screams that something isn't right, even though you can't explain what. At 8 a.m., I was sitting in the parking lot of Pacific Notary Services, the company listed on the deed transfer stamp. I'd looked them up the night before. They were legitimate licensed with an actual office in downtown Palo Alto. Part of me had hoped it would be a fake notary company, something that would immediately prove fraud. But no, they were real. The notary who'd supposedly witnessed my signature was a woman named Linda Espinoza. She was in her 60s, professional with the kind of no-nonsense demeanour that comes from decades of handling legal documents. When I showed her the papers, she pulled out her notary journal and flipped through to March 15th. "Yes, I notarized several documents that day," she said, running her finger down the entries. "But I don't see your name here. Are you sure about the date?" "That's what the document shows," I said, pointing to the notary stamp. "March 15th, 2:30 p.m. She frowned, checking her journal again. "That's strange. I was notarizing documents that afternoon, but nothing for a page, Warren. And this stamp..." She pulled out a magnifying glass and examined it closely. "This is my seal, but the impression looks slightly different. See how the border is a little thicker? Someone may have created a duplicate." My stomach dropped. "So, this is definitely fraudulent." "I can't make that determination," she said carefully. "But I can tell you with certainty that I did not notarize this document, and I have no record of ever meeting you before today. You should report this to the county recorder's office immediately." From there, I went to Davis Forensic Services, a document examination firm I'd found through a frantic 2 a.m. Google search. Dr. Rachel Davis was a certified forensic document examiner who'd testified in court cases for over 20 years. She took one look at the signature and asked for samples of my real handwriting. I gave her everything I had: old birthday cards, work, documents, journal entries. She spent 30 minutes examining them under various lights and magnification tools before she finally looked up at me. "This is a very good forgery," she said, "but it's still a forgery. See here." She pointed to the G in my signature. "Your natural handwriting shows a particular hesitation point, right here where the loop connects to the stem. It's microscopic, barely visible, but it's consistent across every sample you've provided. The signature on this deed transfer doesn't have it. The pressure points are also wrong. Whoever copied your signature was working from a visual reference, probably tracing or practicing, but they couldn't replicate the exact pressure you apply at certain points. It's neurologically impossible. Everyone's hand pressure is as unique as their fingerprint. So, you can prove this isn't my signature. I can testify in court that in my professional opinion, this signature was not produced by the same hand that created your known signature samples. Whether that's enough to prove forgery would be up to a judge, but yes, this is not your signature." Relief and fury warred inside me. I had proof. I had expert testimony. But my next stop made my relief evaporate entirely. The Santa Clara County Recorder's office was housed in a utilitarian government building that smelled like copy toner and bureaucracy. I waited in line for 20 minutes before finally reaching a clerk who could help me. "I need to check the status of a property deed," I said, sliding the documents across the counter. "I believe a fraudulent transfer was filed." The clerk typed my address into her computer and her eyebrows rose. "This deed transfer was recorded on March 18th. According to our records, you and Robert Warren are listed as joint owners, each holding a 50% interest." The words hit me like ice water. "It's already been filed. It's official." "Yes, ma'am. Once a deed is recorded with our office, it becomes part of the public record. If you believe there was fraud, you'll need to file a motion with the Superior Court to have it set aside. But until a judge orders otherwise, this is the legal ownership status of your property." I walked out of that building feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. It wasn't just that someone had forged my signature. They'd taken the extra step of filing it with the county, making it official, embedding the lie into the legal system itself. This wasn't a desperate last-minute scheme. This was calculated, planned. Someone had thought this through. I knew exactly who that someone was. When I got home, both Dad and Melissa were in the living room. I walked straight up to them and placed Davis's preliminary findings on the coffee table. A forensic document examiner just confirmed that the signature on those deed transfer papers is forged. I said, my voice deadly calm. The notary whose seal appears on the document has no record of ever meeting me. And somehow, despite all of this being fraudulent, it's already been filed with the county recorder's office. Dad's face went pale, but Melissa barely reacted. She just smiled that sweet, patronising smile and said, "Are you sure you didn't sign it and forget you've been so stressed lately? Working those long hours, travelling so much, it's not surprising that some things might slip your mind." "I was in Boston on March 15th, I said through clenched teeth. "I have plane tickets, hotel receipts, time-stamped photos with clients. There is no possible way I signed those documents." "Memory is such a tricky thing," Melissa continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "I read an article just last week about how stress can cause memory gaps. Maybe you signed them before you left for Boston and just forgot, or maybe someone at your office notarized them for you." "Stop," I said. "Just stop. I know what you're doing. I know this is fraud, and I'm going to prove it." "If you really believe that, then I guess you'll need to take it up with the courts," she said, examining her manicured nails. "But court cases are so expensive and time-consuming. Are you sure you want to put yourself through that kind of stress? Maybe it would be easier to just accept the situation and move forward." Dad hadn't said a word. He just sat there staring at his hands, and I realised with a sick jolt that he wasn't surprised by any of this. He knew. He'd known all along. "You're both going to regret this," I said quietly and walked out of the room. That night, I couldn't sleep. Again. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out my next move. Around midnight, I heard voices through the wall. My bedroom shared a wall with Dad's suite. Normally, I couldn't make out words, but they were talking loudly, almost arguing. I got up and pressed my ear against the wall. "Told you she'd figure it out eventually," Dad was saying, his voice stressed. "This is too risky." "Relax," Melissa's voice calm and controlled. "She can't prove anything that matters. By the time she gets a lawyer and files motions, we'll be ready. Step 2 is almost complete. Once she's out, we move to phase 3. And you're sure?" "I'm sure. I've done this before. Remember? Trust me." I stood there in the dark, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Step 2, phase 3. I've done this before. This wasn't just about my house. This was bigger, more calculated. And Melissa had done it before. I didn't go back to bed. Instead, I sat on my bedroom floor with my back against the wall, my phone recording every word that came through. The conversation had moved on to logistics, something about timing and paperwork, and making sure everything is airtight this time. By the time they finally went quiet around 2 a.m., I had 17 minutes of audio that proved this was premeditated, calculated, and that my father was fully aware of what they were doing. I waited until morning. Let them have their coffee, their normal routine, their false sense of security. Then, at 8 a.m., I walked into the living room where they sat reading the newspaper like a typical suburban couple, and I played the recording. Melissa's voice came through crystal clear. Step 2 is almost complete. Once she's out, we move to phase 3. Dad's response, and you're sure? I'm sure. I've done this before, remember. I watched my father's face drain of colour. All the blood just left, leaving him grey and slack-jawed. For a moment I thought he might actually confess, might actually break down and admit what they'd been planning. Instead he said, "You recorded us. You were spying on private conversations in our own home." "My home," I corrected. "And yes, when I overheard you discussing your scheme to steal it from me, I documented it. Would you like to explain what phase 3 is?" Melissa recovered faster than Dad did. She set down her coffee cup with a small laugh, shaking her head like I was a confused child who'd just said something adorably wrong. "Paige, honey, you must have heard wrong. We were talking about redecorating plans. Phase 3 is the kitchen renovation we've been discussing." "You said, I've done this before," I said, looking directly at her. "You've done what? Before Melissa stolen houses from people, forged signatures, conned elderly men. That's enough." Dad stood up, his voice sharp. "I will not have you disrespecting Melissa like this. We're trying to help you, trying to make this transition easier, and you're creating conspiracy theories about people who love you." "Love me?" I stared at him. "You're trying to evict me from my own house using forged documents, and you think that's love?" "We just want what's best for the family," Dad said, but his voice wavered. "You're overworked, overstressed, and you're starting to see threats where there aren't any. Maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist, someone who can help you process whatever's going on." Melissa nodded sympathetically. "I've been worried about you too, the way you've been acting lately, paranoid, accusatory, emotional. These are classic signs of a breakdown. Work stress can do terrible things to a person's mental state." I felt like I was losing my mind, except I knew I wasn't, and that's exactly what they wanted me to question. They were trying to make me doubt my own sanity, my own perceptions, my own evidence. "I have a forensic document examiner's report," I said slowly, "confirming the signature is forged. I have notary records proving the document was never properly witnessed. And I have this recording of you two discussing your scheme. Those aren't delusions, those are facts." "Facts can be misinterpreted when you're not in the right headspace," Melissa said gently. "Please, just think about getting some help. We care about you." I looked at my father, searching his face for any sign that he knew how insane this was. But he just stood there nodding along with Melissa's words, and I realised he was either fully complicit or so completely manipulated that he couldn't see the truth anymore. I left the room without another word and called Tyler. My brother answered on the third ring, his voice groggy. "It's 8 a.m. on a Saturday. This better be good." "Dad and his girlfriend are trying to steal my house," I said without preamble. "They forged my signature on deed transfer documents, and now they're trying to evict me." There was a long pause. Then Tyler sighed. "Paige, what are you talking about?" I explained everything, the forged documents, the notary investigation, the forensic analysis, the recording. I laid it all out in clear, logical terms, expecting him to be shocked, to be angry on my behalf, to offer support. Instead, he said, "Are you serious right now?" "Yes, I'm serious." "Tyler, they're committing fraud." Dad finally finds someone who makes him happy. Someone who actually wants to take care of him, and you're trying to ruin it with these crazy accusations. His voice was hard dismissive. "Why are you making drama? Can't you just be happy for him?" Happy? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Tyler, they forged my signature. I have proof." You have some expert saying what you paid them to say. Come on, Paige. You've always been controlling. You've always needed everything to be your way. Dad moves in and suddenly you can't handle not being the center of attention, so you create this whole conspiracy theory. I'm not creating anything. The documents are fake. I was in Boston when they were supposedly signed. Or maybe you signed them and forgot. Maybe you're so stressed from work that you're not remembering things clearly. Have you considered that? Or is it easier to blame Dad and Melissa than to admit you might need help? The words hit me like a slap. My own brother, the person who'd known me my entire life, was choosing to believe I was either lying or crazy rather than consider that Dad might be capable of this. I can't believe you're taking his side, I said quietly. I'm not taking sides, I'm being rational. Dad has been nothing but grateful for your generosity in letting him stay there. If he asked you to make him a co-owner so he'd feel more secure, that's actually really reasonable. You're making this into something it's not. He didn't ask me. Someone forged. I have to go, Tyler interrupted. My family's waiting for breakfast. Maybe you should use this weekend to relax, get some perspective. You're sounding really unhinged right now, and honestly, it's concerning. He hung up. I sat on my bed staring at my phone, feeling more alone than I'd felt since Mum left. My father was trying to steal my house. My brother thought I was having a breakdown. And I had no one to turn to, no one who believed me. That's when I noticed it. The small jewellery box on my dresser, the wooden one Mum had given me, the one that had disappeared and mysteriously reappeared last week, was open. I'd been keeping it closed since I found it again, checking it obsessively to make sure Mum's wedding ring was still there. I walked over on shaking legs and looked inside. The ring was gone. Not misplaced. Not fallen behind the dresser. Gone. The box was empty, except for a few worthless pieces, and Mum's simple gold wedding band, the last physical piece of her I had left, had vanished. I stood there staring at the empty space where the ring should have been, and something inside me crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. I had two choices: accept defeat or fight back. I chose war. The first call I made was to Mrs. Chen, not my neighbour, but her niece, Margaret Chen, the real estate attorney, whose business card had been tucked into a book of Mum's that I'd found years ago. I'd kept it without really knowing why, just a vague sense that Mum had wanted me to have it. Now I understood. Margaret answered on the second ring. Chen and Associates. My name is Paige Warren. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I think you knew my mother, Sarah Warren. She passed away 26 years ago, but she left me your card. I need help. Someone is trying to steal my house. There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. Sarah's daughter. Yes, I remember her talking about you. She showed me pictures you had her eyes. Hold on, let me close my office door. I heard movement, a door clicking shut. Then Margaret's voice came back all business. Tell me everything. I did. The forged deed transfer, the fraudulent notarization, the recording of Melissa admitting she'd done this before, Dad's complicity, Tyler's dismissal, the missing ring. It all poured out in a rush, and Margaret didn't interrupt once. When I finally finished, there was a long silence. How old is your father? She asked. 68. And how long has he known this woman? 2 months? Maybe 3. Paige, what you're describing is textbook elder financial abuse. Your father is 68, recently divorced, emotionally vulnerable. Melissa targeted him, isolated him from you, and manipulated him into participating in fraud. If she's done this before, and I believe you when you say she has, then she's a professional con artist. This isn't just about property law, this is criminal. The word criminal sent a jolt through me. I'd been thinking of this as a civil matter, a property dispute. But Margaret was right. This was crime. Can you help me? I asked. I can, and I will. Your mother was one of my closest friends in college. She'd want me to fight for you. Margaret's voice softened slightly. She talked about you all the time, you know. How smart you were, how strong. She always said you were going to do incredible things. I'm sorry she didn't get to see it." My throat tightened, but I pushed the emotion down. There would be time for grief later. Right now, I needed to be strategic. "What do I do first?" I asked. "First, you document everything. Every conversation, every interaction, every piece of evidence. Second, you secure your assets. Third, you prepare for them to escalate because they will. People who commit fraud don't stop when they get caught. They double down. Can you come to my office Monday morning? We need to move fast." We set the appointment for 9 a.m, and the moment I hung up, I started executing the plan that had been forming in my mind. I drove to Best Buy and bought 3 hidden cameras, the kind that look like phone chargers or picture frames. I installed one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one in the hallway outside my bedroom. All pointed at common areas, all completely legal, since this was my house. If Melissa and Dad were going to plot, I was going to have video evidence. Next stop was the bank. I opened a safe deposit box and transferred every important document. I had my original deed mortgage papers, tax returns, passport, birth certificate, Mum's death certificate, and the few pieces of her jewellery that Melissa hadn't stolen yet. I also withdrew $10,000 in cash and put it in the box. If they were planning to lock me out of my accounts, somehow I'd have emergency funds. At the Apple Store, I bought a new laptop and phone, leaving my existing devices at home. If Melissa had access to my current devices, and given how thoroughly she'd infiltrated my life, I had to assume she did, I needed clean technology. I set up new email accounts, new cloud storage, new everything. I transferred copies of all my evidence to the new secure accounts. The hardware store was my next stop. I bought biometric door locks for my bedroom and home office, the kind that only opened with my fingerprint. The teenager helping me load them into my cart looked at me curiously. "Someone you don't trust?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. I installed the locks that afternoon while Dad and Melissa were out. It took me 3 hours and multiple YouTube tutorials, but by the time they came home, both rooms were secured. I tested them twice, making sure only my fingerprint would open the doors. When Dad saw the new lock on my bedroom door, his face went red. "What is this security?" I said simply. After my jewellery box went missing, I decided to upgrade my locks. "You're locking us out of parts of our own house." "My house," I corrected. "And yes, my private spaces will remain private." Melissa appeared behind him, and I saw something flash across her face, anger quickly masked. "That seems a bit paranoid, don't you think we're family?" "Family doesn't steal from each other," I said, meeting her eyes. "But if you have nothing to hide, then you won't mind that I've secured my personal spaces." That night, I changed every digital password I had. Bank accounts, credit cards, email, social media, utilities, even my grocery delivery app. I enabled 2-factor authentication on everything. I called my credit card companies and put fraud alerts on all my accounts. I contacted the 3 credit bureaus and froze my credit so no one could open new accounts in my name. It was past midnight when I finally sat down with a notebook and started documenting everything I could remember from the past 8 weeks. Every strange comment Melissa had made, every time Dad had sided with her against me, every missing item, every changed bill. I wrote it all down with dates and times as precisely as I could recall. Monday morning, I walked into Margaret Chen's office carrying 2 file boxes of evidence. She spent 3 hours reviewing everything: the forged documents, the forensic analysis, the notary statement, the audio recording, my detailed timeline, the credit card statements I'd pulled showing Dad's new cards that Melissa had opened. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "This is worse than I thought," she said. "Melissa hasn't just forged a deed transfer. She's been systematically positioning herself to take everything. Look at this," she pointed to the credit card statements. "She's been building debt in your father's name, probably planning to default and blame him. The forged deed transfer makes him appear as co-owner, which means creditors could potentially go after the house for his debts." She's trying to force a sale, I said, the pieces clicking together. Exactly. Once the house is encumbered with enough debt, she'll push for a forced sale to settle accounts. As 50% owner or so, the fraudulent deed claims she'd be entitled to half the proceeds. Your father likely won't see a dime of his share, and you'll lose the home you actually own. What do we do? Margaret pulled out a legal pad and started writing. We file suit to void the fraudulent deed transfer. We get a forensic accountant to trace all the financial fraud. We notify the district attorney's office about potential elder financial abuse, and we prepare for them to fight back hard. How hard? Margaret looked at me seriously. Paige, people who commit fraud at this level don't do it once. If Melissa has done this before, she has a playbook. She knows how victims react, and she knows how to counter every move. She'll probably try to discredit you, claim you're unstable. Maybe file for a restraining order, claiming you're threatening them. Possibly even report you to your employer for erratic behaviour. Her goal will be to make you seem like the problem, while she positions herself as the reasonable party. So what do I do? You stay 3 steps ahead. You document everything. You never lose your temper in front of them, never give them ammunition, and you trust that the evidence will speak for itself. I left her office with a strategy, a timeline, and a court date. We'd be filing the lawsuit by the end of the week. Margaret's warning echoed in my mind. They won't stop here. Prepare for them to escalate. She was right. The escalation came faster than I expected. 3 days after my meeting with Margaret, I came home from work to find my house key wouldn't turn in the lock. I tried again, thinking maybe I was tired and had the wrong angle. Nothing. The key slid in but wouldn't engage. I pulled it out and examined it definitely. My key definitely the right one. But the lock had been changed. I rang the doorbell. Melissa answered, surprise painted across her face, like she'd been rehearsing the expression. Oh, Paige, I'm so glad you're here. We upgraded the security system today, got one of those smart locks, much safer. Let me get you set up with the app. You changed the locks on my house without telling me. We were going to mention it tonight at dinner, she said smoothly, pulling out her phone. Your father has been worried about break-ins in the neighbourhood. This system is much more secure. Here, I'll add your fingerprint to the system right now. She led me through the setup process, and I watched my access level on the app, resident, limited access. Dad and Melissa were both listed as owner, full access. Why am I listed as limited access? I asked, my voice tight. Oh, that's just the default setting for additional users. Don't worry about the labels, you can still get in whenever you need to. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. That weekend, I ran into my neighbour Tom while checking my mailbox. He'd lived on the street for 20 years, always friendly, always up for chatting about property values and local politics. But today, he looked uncomfortable when he saw me. Hey Tom, I said. Paige? He nodded but didn't stop walking. Everything okay? He hesitated, then sighed. Look, I don't want to get involved in family stuff, but your dad's girlfriend came by last week. Said she's his primary caregiver now that you've been having some issues. My stomach dropped. What kind of issues? She didn't go into details, just said you'd been under a lot of stress, that your mental health has been concerning, and that we should let her know if we see anything worrying. Said you might become unpredictable or even dangerous. He looked embarrassed. I didn't believe it for what it's worth. You've always seemed perfectly fine to me. Tom, none of that is true. I'm not... I know. That's why I'm telling you. But she's been making the rounds. Pretty sure most of the block has heard some version of this story. After Tom left, I stood there in my driveway, shaking with rage. Melissa was systematically destroying my reputation, isolating me, turning my own neighbourhood against me. When I confronted her later that day, she just looked hurt. I was only trying to help, she said. I noticed you've seemed stressed, and I thought, if the neighbours knew to look out for you, it might help. I'm worried about you, Paige. We all are. The HOA letter arrived on Monday, a formal notice that complaints had been filed against my property for excessive noise disturbances and running an unauthorised business from the residents. Both accusations were completely false. I worked standard office hours at a corporate campus 20 minutes away. My home was as quiet as a library, but the complaints were officially filed anonymously and required a formal written response within 10 days or face potential fines. More of my time, more of my energy drained away dealing with problems Melissa had manufactured. Then came the alert that made my blood run cold. I'd registered Mum's wedding ring on a pawn shop tracking database years ago, just in case it was ever lost or stolen. On Tuesday afternoon, my phone pinged with a notification. A ring matching the description had been sold at Gold and Silver Exchange in San Jose 2 weeks earlier. I called the shop immediately. The owner pulled up the transaction. Yeah, I remember this one. Simple gold band inscription inside. Guy who sold it said it was his late wife's ring that he was ready to let it go. Do you have his ID on file? Sure do. Robert Warren. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. Dad had sold Mum's ring. Or someone had sold it using his ID. And given everything else that had happened, I knew exactly who. I drove straight to the pawn shop with a copy of the police report I'd filed for the theft and my proof of ownership. The owner was sympathetic but firm. The transaction was legal. He had valid ID. I can't just give it back without a court order. How much? I asked. He sold it for $150. I could sell it back to you for $225. I bought back my own mother's ring for $225, blinking away tears the entire drive home. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was personal, vicious. They were taking everything my home, my reputation, my memories, and wrapping each theft in plausible deniability and fake concern. That night, I called Margaret and told her everything. File the lawsuit, I said. Tomorrow, I'm done waiting. That's when I filed the lawsuit, and all hell broke loose. Margaret filed the complaint on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Dad and Melissa had been served with papers at my house where they were living because of my generosity, now claiming they had every right to be there. The lawsuit was comprehensive fraudulent deed, recording theft by deception, elder financial abuse against Melissa specifically, and an emergency motion for injunctive relief to restore my full property rights and prevent any further transfers or encumbrances. I wasn't there when they were served. Margaret had advised me to stay away, let the process server do their job without drama. But Mrs. Chen called me 20 minutes later. They're screaming, she said quietly. Your father is pacing in the driveway, and that woman is on her phone. She looks angry, really angry. Good, I said, surprised by the coldness in my own voice. Let them be angry. By Friday, Dad had hired an attorney. Bradley Morrison was 34 years old, fresh off winning some high-profile personal injury cases, all slicked back hair and expensive suits. Margaret knew him by reputation, aggressive, theatrical, willing to push ethical boundaries if he thought he could get away with it. Morrison's counterclaim arrived via email on Friday evening, and reading it made my stomach turn. According to the document, I was guilty of elder harassment and intimidation, had engaged in fraudulent gift rescission by trying to take back property I'd supposedly given Dad willingly, and was attempting to unlawfully evict a lawful co-owner from his residence. The countersuit demanded I pay Dad's legal fees, compensate him for emotional distress, and formally acknowledge his ownership rights. It was all lies. Calculated, documented lies presented in official legal language that made them sound almost plausible. Don't let it rattle you, Margaret said when I called her in a panic. This is standard defense strategy, attack. The plaintiff muddy the waters, make you look like the aggressor. But we have evidence, and evidence beats rhetoric every time. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks, out May 15th. Judge Patricia Whitmore would hear initial arguments and review the emergency motion. If the case didn't settle, we'd be looking at a full trial sometime in late September or October. 4 to 5 months, I said, doing the math. I have to live with them for 4 to 5 more months. The judge might grant the emergency motion and require them to move out sooner, Margaret said. But yes, you need to prepare for the long haul. Can you handle it? I thought about Mum's ring, the one I'd just bought back. I thought about the rose garden Melissa was slowly killing. I thought about every time Dad had chosen someone else over me, every time I'd been invisible. I can handle it, I said. On Monday morning, Judge Whitmore issued her initial ruling on the emergency motions. She denied my request to have Dad and Melissa removed from the property immediately. Insufficient evidence of immediate danger or irreparable harm, but she granted the status quo order. No one could sell the house, transfer any interest, take out loans against it, or make major alterations until the case was resolved. She also ordered both parties to maintain detailed financial records and prohibited either side from disposing of any relevant documents. It was a partial victory. They couldn't push forward with whatever phase 3 was, but I still had to live with them. Margaret seemed satisfied. The status quo order is actually huge. It freezes them in place. Whatever they were planning, they can't execute it now without contempt of court charges. We've bought ourselves time to build the case. The preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks out. 6 weeks of living in a house with 2 people who were actively trying to destroy me. 6 weeks of walking past them in the hallway, sharing a kitchen, pretending civility while collecting evidence of their fraud. I could do 6 weeks. I'd survived worse. The week after the status quo order, I fell into a careful routine. I left for work early, came home late. I ate dinner in my room with my new biometric lock engaged. I documented everything, took photos of the rose garden's deterioration, made notes of every conversation, backed up all my hidden camera footage to secure cloud storage. I was building a case brick by brick, evidence by evidence. I thought I'd seen Melissa's worst, the forgery, the reputation destruction, the theft. I thought I understood the depths she'd sink to. Then, 2 weeks before the preliminary hearing, I was sitting in my car in the grocery store parking lot, checking my phone before heading inside when someone knocked on my window. I looked up to see a woman I'd never met before, middle-aged, with grey-streaked hair and desperate eyes, gesturing for me to roll down the window. I rolled it down halfway, my hand already on my phone, ready to call for help if needed. "Paige Warren," the woman asked, her voice shaking. "Who's asking? My name is Linda Morrison. I was married to your father 30 years ago, before your mother." She pulled out her driver's license, showed me the name. "Melissa Grant destroyed my life too. I saw your lawsuit in the public records. Please, you have to be careful. She's more dangerous than you think." My entire body went cold. Linda Morrison, the first wife Dad never talked about, the ghost Melissa resembled. "What do you mean she destroyed your life?" "She conned my father, convinced him I was stealing from him, forged documents making her his caregiver, isolated him from the family. By the time we figured out what was happening, he'd changed his will and she'd taken everything. Dad died 6 months later and Melissa disappeared with $300,000. Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I tried to press charges, but she was gone. New name, new state. I've been tracking her for 15 years. When I saw her name on your case filing, I knew she'd found another victim." We sat in that parking lot for 30 minutes while Linda told me everything. Melissa wasn't even her real name. She'd used at least 4 different identities. She targeted older men with assets, particularly those with strained family relationships. She was smart, methodical, and had never been successfully prosecuted because she always disappeared before charges could stick. "Get a private investigator," Linda said. "Document everything, and whatever you do, don't let her leave before trial. Once she runs, you'll never find her." I gave Linda my attorney's information and promised to stay in touch. Then I drove home, with my hand shaking on the wheel, Linda's warning replaying in my mind. "She's more dangerous than you think." Mrs. Chen was waiting on my front porch when I pulled good into the driveway. She held a large manila envelope in her weathered hands, and her expression was grave. "We need to talk," she said. "Not here, my house." I followed her through the gate in our shared fence into her small kitchen that always smelled like jasmine tea and star anise. She set the envelope on the table between us. "Your mother gave me this 15 years ago, 6 months before she left," Mrs. Chen said. "She made me promise only give it to Paige if she ever has to fight for this house. She knew. Your mother knew someone would try to take what was yours." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside were bank statements from an account I'd never seen before. Washington Mutual Bank opened in my mother's name in 1998. The final balance dated 3 weeks before she left was $52,847. Mum had this much saved. She put away every penny she could for years. She wanted you to have something that was just yours, something your father couldn't control or take away. Mrs. Chen's voice was soft but firm. "After she left, your father closed the account, claimed it was community property, used it for family expenses. He took my mother's money. He took your money. She left instructions the account was to be transferred to you when you turned 18. But your father got a lawyer, argued she'd abandoned the family and forfeited her rights to designate beneficiaries. The bank released the funds to him." I stared at the statements, at Mum's careful handwriting on the deposit slips. $5 here, 20 there, sometimes 100 when she could manage it. Years of secret saving, all stolen. "There's more," Mrs. Chen said quietly. She pulled out a worn notebook, the kind with a marbled cover that was popular decades ago. "My story. I want you to read it." She told me while I held her journal. 20 years ago, Mrs. Chen's son had married a woman who immediately began poisoning him against his mother. Within 2 years, they'd convinced Mrs. Chen to transfer her house into her son's name for estate planning purposes. Within 3 years, she'd been relegated to a small back bedroom, forbidden from having friends visit her entire social security check going to her son for household expenses. "I never fought back," Mrs. Chen said, and tears rolled down her weathered cheeks. "I told myself he was my son, that he'd never truly hurt me. But I disappeared in that house, just like you're disappearing in yours." "Mrs. Chen?" "No." She pressed the journal into my hands. "You read this. You see what happens when we stay silent. Your mother stayed silent until she couldn't anymore, and it destroyed her. I stayed silent, and I lost 20 years. You're fighting, you're doing what we couldn't. Fight for me. Fight for your mother. Fight for all of us who couldn't." I opened the journal right there at her kitchen table. Page after page of careful documentation, dates her son yelled at her time she wasn't allowed to eat dinner with, them lists of her belongings that had been thrown away or sold. It read like a horror story, except it was real. It had happened in the house right next to mine. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because your father came to see me last week," Mrs. Chen said. "He wanted to know if I'd testify that you've always been troubled that your mother left because she couldn't handle raising you. He offered me money, Paige. Your own father offered me money to lie about you in court." The betrayal cut deeper than anything else had. Not just participating in Melissa's scheme, but actively trying to recruit people to destroy me. "What did you say?" "I told him to get off my property." Mrs. Chen took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "I will testify for you. I will tell them everything about your mother, about my own experience, about how these patterns work. You are not alone." I cried then for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Not quiet tears, but deep, shaking sobs. Mrs. Chen held me like my mother used to, and I let myself break for just a few minutes before I had to be strong again. I promised her I would fight, for both of us, for all of us. But I didn't know my own brother was about to betray me. The preliminary hearing was 1 week away when Margaret called with news that made my stomach drop. "Your brother's attorney contacted me this morning," she said, her voice tight. Tyler has volunteered to testify as a character witness for your father. They're submitting a written statement for the preliminary hearing. Tyler wouldn't do that, I said automatically, even though part of me knew better. He dismissed me when I called him, but he wouldn't actively testify against me. I'm having this statement couriered to you now, Paige. I'm sorry, you should read it before the hearing. The statement arrived 2 hours later. I sat in my locked bedroom and read my brother's words, each sentence a knife between my ribs. My sister Paige has always struggled with control issues and an inability to share. Growing up, she was intensely jealous of my relationship with our father and would often create conflicts to get attention. When Dad finally found happiness with Melissa, after years of loneliness, Paige couldn't handle not being the centre of his world. Rather than be happy for him, she's manufactured this elaborate conspiracy theory about fraud and theft. I believe my sister is experiencing a mental health crisis brought on by work stress and her inability to form healthy relationships. She's never been able to accept that our father has a right to his own life and happiness. This lawsuit is her way of punishing him for moving on. I read it 3 times each time, hoping the words would somehow change, but they didn't. My own brother, the person who'd known me since the day he was born, had written a formal statement calling me controlling, jealous, and mentally unstable. The statement was entered into the preliminary hearing record, which meant it was public. Within 24 hours, somehow, it had been leaked to extended family. My phone started ringing that evening. First, Aunt Marie, Dad's older sister, calling to tell me I should be ashamed of myself for dragging family business into court. Then Uncle Paul saying he'd always known I had my mother's dramatic streak. Cousin Jennifer sent a long text about how family forgives family, and I was tearing everyone apart over money. None of them asked my side. None of them wanted to hear about the forged documents or the stolen ring or the systematic financial abuse. They'd read Tyler's statement and that was enough. I was the problem, the difficult daughter, the one causing drama. By the weekend, half the family had taken Dad's side. The other half simply stopped responding to my messages entirely. I sat alone in my bedroom on Saturday night, listening to Dad and Melissa laughing in my living room, and wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. Maybe I should just let them have the house, walk away, start over somewhere else where no one knew my family history. I could sell my half if the court would even let me take whatever money I could salvage and disappear like Mum did. She'd walked away when it became too much. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe fighting was just another way of staying stuck in a family that had never really wanted me. Mrs. Chen's journal sat on my nightstand, but I couldn't bring myself to open it again. Reading about her suffering would just remind me that fighting back could take years, decades even, and still not guarantee justice. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from Tyler. It's not too late to drop the lawsuit. Dad said he'd be willing to work something out if you apologise to Melissa and agree to counselling. Think about it. Apologise to Melissa for being the victim of her fraud, for having the audacity to fight back. I typed and deleted 5 different responses before finally turning off my phone. That's when I understood what Melissa had done. She hadn't just stolen my property, she'd engineered the complete destruction of my family relationships. She'd turned my brother against me, poisoned my extended family, isolated me so thoroughly that even if I won in court, I'd still lose everything that mattered. Maybe that was her real gift. Making victims choose between justice and family, making the price of fighting back so high that most people just surrendered. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, genuinely questioning, for the first time, whether I should continue. The preliminary hearing was in 6 days. I could withdraw the lawsuit. I could be the bigger person, let it go, try to salvage some relationship with Dad and Tyler. I could stop being the problem everyone claimed I was. The rose garden was dying. Mrs. Chen was alone in her back room for 20 years. Mum ran away and never came back. Linda Morrison lost her father and $300,000 and never got justice. Maybe that's just how these stories ended. Maybe the bad guys win because the cost of fighting is too high. My phone rang at 6 a.m. Sunday morning. Margaret's name on the screen. The cameras caught everything. You need to see this. I was at her office within 40 minutes, still in the sweatpants I'd slept in, my hair unwashed, eyes puffy from a night of almost crying, but refusing to let the tears fall. Margaret had coffee waiting and her laptop already open to a video file. "This is from the camera in your living room," she said. "Recorded 4 weeks ago, 2 days after you left for that Chicago business trip." She pressed play. The timestamp showed 10:47 p.m. Dad sat at my dining table, the antique oak table I'd refinished myself, with a stack of papers spread out in front of him. Melissa stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, watching as he held a pen over a document. "Try it again," Melissa's voice came through crystal clear. "The P needs more of a flourish at the top. Watch." She leaned over and traced something on a separate sheet of paper. "See, like that." Dad's hand moved across the page. Once, twice, 3 times. "Better," Melissa said. "But the G in page needs to be more looped. You're making it too tight. Look at this sample." She pointed to something off camera, presumably an example of my real signature. "See how she extends the bottom loop? That's her signature tau. Make the G more looped." "Perfect. Again." Dad practiced the signature 6 more times while Melissa coached his every stroke. My father, the man who was supposed to protect me, was sitting in my house at my table, using my light and my electricity, practicing how to forge my signature, well enough to fool experts. "That's enough for tonight," Melissa finally said. "We'll do the final version tomorrow when your hand is steadier. The notary seal I ordered should arrive by Wednesday." Dad looked up at her, and even through the grainy camera footage, I could see the uncertainty on his face. "Are you sure about this? If Paige finds out—" "She won't find out. She's too busy with work to notice anything. And even if she does question it later, by then it'll be done. The house will be in both your names, and she can't do anything about it." Melissa's voice was soothing, almost hypnotic. "You deserve this, Robert. After everything you've sacrificed, after raising her alone, you deserve to have security. She owes you this." Margaret paused the video. "There are 3 more sessions like this over the next week, but it gets worse." She fast-forwarded to a different timestamp, different day. Melissa alone in the living room, pacing while talking on her phone, clearly thinking she had complete privacy. "The deed transfer goes through next week," she was saying. "Once that's filed, and she's out, the house sells for at least $1 million, maybe more in this market. Your cut is 20%, like we agreed. I know it took longer than Denver, but this one's bigger. No, the daughter's not a problem. She's too passive. I've been watching her for weeks. She's the type who'd rather keep the peace than make a scene. The old man's easy, lonely, desperate for attention, still bitter about his first wife leaving. Classic Mark." She laughed at something the person on the other end said. 3 months tops. Soon as the house sells, I'm gone. Already have the new identity set up. Nevada, probably. Maybe Arizona. Yeah, same playbook. Find a widower with assets and a strained family relationship. Make him feel special. Isolate him from the kids. Get access to the property. It works. Every single time. I felt like I was going to be sick. Margaret paused the video again. "There's more," she said gently. "Do you want to keep going?" I nodded, unable to speak. The next clip made me gasp out loud. Melissa in my bedroom. My private, locked bedroom, though. This was before I'd installed the biometric locks. The timestamp showed 3:15 p.m. on a Tuesday when I was at work. She walked straight to my dresser, opened the wooden jewellery box Mum had given me, and pulled out the wedding ring. "She won't even notice," Melissa said, though there was no one else visible in the frame. She must have been talking to herself, or maybe she was on a Bluetooth call. She's too busy to care about sentimental junk, probably doesn't even remember what's in here. She slipped the ring into her pocket, closed the box, and walked out. I watched my mother's ring, the last physical piece of her I had left, disappear into Melissa's pocket like it was nothing. like my memories, my grief, my connection to the only parent who'd ever really loved me was just sentimental junk to be pawned for cash. Margaret closed the laptop. I've isolated 17 separate clips showing fraudulent activity. Dad forging your signature. Melissa stealing jewelry and small valuable items. Multiple phone calls where she discusses the con explicitly. And one particularly damning conversation where your father expresses doubt and Melissa tells him if he backs out now, she'll claim he was the one who planned everything and she was just following his lead. She's blackmailing him too, I said quietly. Which might help explain his behaviour, yes. He's not innocent, he actively participated in the forgery, but she's clearly the mastermind. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Paige, this is slam dunk evidence, both for your civil case and for criminal prosecution. I can send this to the DA today, and Melissa would likely be arrested by tomorrow morning. Wire fraud, identity theft, elder, financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, she's looking at serious prison time. I should have felt victorious, vindicated, but all I felt was tired and sad and angry. What about the preliminary hearing? I asked. We can submit this as evidence. It would likely result in an immediate ruling in your favour. Case over. I thought about Tyler's statement, about Dad's attorney already preparing to call me mentally unstable, about Bradley Morrison's plan to paint me as the villain while Dad and Melissa played the sympathetic victims. No, I said slowly. Don't submit it yet. Don't tell the DA yet. Margaret raised her eyebrows. Why not? Because I want to see them lie under oath first. I want it on record, Dad claiming he never forged anything, Melissa playing the concerned stepmother, both of them swearing I'm delusional. Then we show the videos. That's risky, Margaret warned. If something goes wrong with the evidence admission, nothing will go wrong. You said it yourself, this is slam dunk evidence. But I need the court to see who they really are first. I need it documented that they were willing to commit perjury to double down on their lies, even under oath. I met her eyes. I need them to have no way out when the truth comes. Margaret studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but the moment I think they might flee, we're submitting everything to law enforcement. Deal. Deal. But I insisted we wait to reveal it. I wanted to see them lie under oath first. 6 weeks crawled by like 6 years. I lived in my house like a ghost, moving through spaces that no longer felt like mine, documenting everything, saying nothing. Dad and Melissa grew more confident as the hearing approached their whispered conversations in the hallway, taking on an almost celebratory tone. They thought they were winning. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I woke at 5 a.m. and stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes trying to decide what to wear. Margaret had advised, professional but approachable, we want you to look competent, not cold. I settled on a navy blazer and cream blouse, pulled my hair back in a simple ponytail, and wore the small pearl earrings Mum had left me. I wanted her with me, even if it was just the memory of her tucked against my earlobes. The Santa Clara County Superior Court was a massive concrete building that smelled like floor polish and anxiety. Courtroom 4B on the 3rd floor, Judge Patricia Whitmore presiding. I'd looked her up obsessively over the past weeks. 30 years on the bench, reputation for no-nonsense rulings, background in real estate law. Fair, people said. Tough, but fair. Margaret squeezed my hand as we took our seats at the plaintiff's table. Remember, this is just preliminary. We present the basic case. They present their defense. The judge decides if there's enough to proceed to trial. Stay calm, don't react to anything they say, and trust the process. Across the aisle, Dad sat with Melissa and Bradley Morrison. Dad wore a suit I'd never seen before, expensive, well-tailored, probably Melissa's doing. He looked distinguished, dignified, like a respectable man, being unfairly accused by an ungrateful daughter. Melissa wore soft grey, her hair pulled back, minimal makeup, playing the role of concerned caregiver to perfection. She caught my eye and gave me a small, sad smile that probably read as compassionate to anyone who didn't know better. Judge Whitmore entered and we all stood. She was smaller than I'd imagined from her photos, barely 5'2", with steel grey hair, and reading glasses perched on her nose. But the way she commanded the room left no doubt who was in charge. "This is a preliminary hearing in the matter of Warren versus Warren." She began settling into her chair. "We're here to determine if the plaintiff's claims have sufficient merit to proceed to trial. Mr. Morrison, as defense counsel, you'll present first." Morrison stood with the kind of theatrical confidence that probably worked well with juries, but seemed almost comical in this smaller setting. "Your Honour, this case represents a tragic example of family conflict escalating unnecessarily. My client, Robert Warren, is a 68-year-old man who believed he was entering into a good faith arrangement with his daughter regarding co-ownership of a property. What we have here is not fraud, but a daughter's regret, and her attempt to rescind a gift she willingly gave." He painted a picture of me as controlling jealous of Dad's new relationship, financially comfortable enough that I could afford to be generous, but too petty to follow through. He submitted Tyler's statement, my therapy records, that showed I'd seen a counsellor twice last year for work stress management, and selectively edited text messages that made me look emotionally volatile. Then Dad took the stand. Morrison guided him through the testimony with practiced ease. How I'd invited him to live with me, how grateful he'd been, how we discussed making the arrangement more permanent, how I'd suggested co-ownership would make him feel more secure. "And did your daughter sign the deed transfer willingly?" Morrison asked. "Yes." Dad said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We discussed it over dinner one night in March. She said she wanted me to feel like it was really my home too, that she wanted to make things official. A few days later, she signed the papers." "And when did the problem start?" "After she got back from a business trip. She seemed different, more paranoid, accusatory. She started claiming she didn't remember signing anything, that I must have forged her signature. It was like she became a different person." Melissa took the stand next, and she was magnificent in her deception. Every word delivered with perfect concern, perfect sincerity. "I just want what's best for this family," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Paige has been under so much stress at work, she's told me herself how overwhelmed she feels. When she started accusing Robert and me of these terrible things, we were heartbroken. We're not trying to steal anything. We're trying to help her see that she needs support, maybe professional help." "What makes you believe Miss Warren needs professional help?" Morrison asked. The paranoia, the sudden personality changed the way she's cut herself off from her brother and other family members. She's installed locks on her bedroom door. She's recording conversations without consent. She's created these elaborate theories about us trying to harm her. Melissa shook her head sadly. "These are concerning behaviours. We just want her to get the help she needs before she does something that can't be undone." Margaret objected 3 times during Melissa's testimony, but Morrison had been careful. Everything Melissa said was technically opinion couched in concern, impossible to definitively disprove in this preliminary setting. When they finished, I felt physically ill. They'd made me sound unstable, vindictive, delusional. And worse, they'd made themselves sound reasonable. Then it was our turn. Margaret stood, and her entire demeanour shifted from the polite professionalism of objections to something harder, sharper. "Your Honour, the defence has presented a compelling narrative. Unfortunately for them, it's entirely fictional." She approached Dad, still in the witness box. "Mr. Warren, you testified that your daughter signed the deed transfer willingly after a conversation over dinner in March. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And you were present when she signed it?" A slight hesitation. "Yes." "Can you tell the court what date that was?" "March 15th. "And where was this signing witnessed and notarized?" "At a notary office downtown, Pacific Notary Services. The same notary office that has no record of my client ever being there, and whose notary public has submitted a sworn statement that she never witnessed this signature." Dad's face paled slightly. They must have made a mistake in their records. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, and something in her expression made the entire courtroom seem to hold its breath. Mr. Warren, she said slowly, if your daughter agreed to this transfer verbally, and you were present when she signed it and everything was done in good faith, as you claim. She paused, looking at him over her reading glasses. Then why did you need to forge her signature? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. Dad's mouth opened, then closed. He looked to Bradley Morrison, who was already half standing, clearly about to object, but Judge Whitmore held up one hand. I'd like to hear the answer, Mr. Warren. I didn't forge anything, Dad stammered. His voice had lost all its earlier confidence. She signed it. She must have forgotten. Mr. Warren, the judge interrupted, pulling out a document from the file in front of her. The notary records show this document was supposedly signed and witnessed on March 15th at 2:30 p.m. However, Ms. Warren's employer has provided extensive documentation, flight records, hotel receipts, and time-stamped video conference logs, proving she was in Boston, Massachusetts that entire week from March 13th through March 17th. She was in a client presentation at the exact time this signature was allegedly notarized in Palo Alto, California. Judge Whitmore looked up, her gaze steady and unforgiving. Please explain this discrepancy. The color drained entirely from Dad's face. He looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. There must be a mistake in the dates. Maybe it was a different day. The document is dated March 15th. The notary seal shows March 15th. Your own testimony confirmed March 15th. The judge's voice was ice. Were you lying then, or are you lying now? Your Honor. Morrison jumped in. My client is clearly confused about the specific date. The transfer happened even if the exact timing is unclear. The exact timing is the difference between a legitimate document and fraud counselor. Judge Whitmore's tone made it clear she was not impressed. Continue, Ms. Chen. Margaret approached the witness box with the posture of a hunter who'd just spotted wounded prey. Mr. Warren, you stated you were present when your daughter signed this document, but she wasn't even in California. Who actually signed it? I must be misremembering. Let me help you remember. Margaret pulled out a tablet and set it on the witness stand, where Dad could see the screen. This is phone metadata from your mobile device obtained through legal discovery. On March 8th, 1 week before the supposed signing, you conducted Google searches for the following terms. She read from the screen. How to forge a signature. Deed transfer requirements, California. Penalties for document forgery. Do notaries verify signatures? Would you like to explain why you were researching forgery techniques if your daughter willingly signed the document? Dad's hands were shaking. He looked to Melissa sitting at the defense table, but she was staring fixedly at her lap, her face carefully blank. I was curious about the process. I wanted to make sure everything was done correctly. By researching how to commit fraud, Margaret's voice was sharp. Mr. Warren, on March 10th, your phone also shows searches for duplicate notary seal purchase and create fake notary stamp. These searches originated from your IP address at my client's home. What legitimate reason would you have for researching how to create fraudulent notary seals? Your Honor, this is speculation, Morrison objected, finally finding his voice. Internet searches don't prove action. They prove intent. Judge Whitmore cut him off. And combined with the impossibility of Ms. Warren being present for this signing, they paint a very clear picture. Objection overruled. Margaret wasn't done. She pulled up more documents on the tablet. On March 12th, 3 days before the supposed signing, there were multiple text messages between you and Ms. Grant discussing the papers and making sure the signature matches. On March 14th, the night before the date on this document, Ms. Grant texted you, tomorrow we finalise everything. Don't lose your nerve now. What were you finalising, Mr. Warren? Dad looked like he might be sick. His attorney was furiously whispering something to him, but he just shook his head helplessly. "I loved her," he said finally, his voice breaking. "Melissa, I thought she loved me." She said Paige would be fine with it, that she'd agree eventually, that we just needed to make it official first and explain later. She said... He stopped, seeming to realise he was making everything worse. "She said to forge your daughter's signature," Margaret pressed. "Objection." Morrison was on his feet. "Leading the witness?" "Sustained," Judge Whitmore said, but her expression suggested the damage was already done. "Mr. Warren, you may step down." Dad practically fled from the witness box. As he passed Melissa at the defence table, I saw her shoot him a look of pure contempt before the mask of concerned sympathy slid back into place. Margaret returned to our table and pulled out another document. "Your Honour, I'd like to submit additional evidence. This is a sworn statement from Linda Morrison, ex-wife of Robert Warren, from 30 years ago. She details how Melissa Grant, then using the name Michelle Granger, executed an identical scheme against her elderly father, resulting in the theft of approximately $300,000 before she disappeared." Morrison shot to his feet. "Your Honour, this is completely irrelevant character assassination." "It goes to pattern of behaviour," Margaret countered. "Ms. Grant has a documented history of targeting older men, with assets manipulating them into fraudulent property transfers and disappearing with the proceeds. This isn't a family dispute. It's a pattern of criminal behaviour." Judge Whitmore held up the statement, scanning it quickly. Her expression grew progressively more severe. "I'm going to allow this into evidence. Mr. Morrison, does your client have a response to these allegations?" Melissa stood, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely rattled, but her voice remained steady. "That was a misunderstanding that was never proven. Those charges were dropped. I've done nothing wrong here except try to build a life with the man I love." "The charges were dropped because you fled the jurisdiction," Margaret said. "You've used at least 4 different names over the past 15 years. Michelle Granger, Melissa Davis, Melinda Grant, each time targeting elderly men, each time the same pattern." "Your Honour, none of this is proven," Morrison argued, but his voice lacked conviction. Judge Whitmore set down the papers and looked at both tables. "I've heard enough for today. Based on the evidence presented, particularly the impossibility of Miss Warren signing a document while provably in another state, combined with Mr. Warren's own internet search history and the pattern of behaviour alleged, I find there is substantial evidence of fraudulent activity that warrants complete examination." My heart leapt. "This case will proceed to full trial," the judge continued. "Trial date is set for September 18th, 4 months from now. The status quo order remains in effect. Both parties are prohibited from selling, transferring, or encumbering the property in question. Additionally, I'm issuing an order that Ms. Grant may not leave the state of California without court permission. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down. I sat there stunned as the courtroom began to clear. We'd won the preliminary hearing. The case was going to trial, and Melissa couldn't run. Margaret packed up her files, her expression satisfied but cautious. "Good first round, but remember what I told you. Cornered animals are the most dangerous." I finished. She nodded grimly. "They know we have them now, which means they're going to get desperate. Be very, very careful. We had them cornered, but my attorney warned me cornered animals are the most dangerous." The courthouse had a small cafe on the first floor where Margaret and I retreated during the lunch recess. I couldn't eat, my stomach still churning from watching Dad disintegrate on the witness stand, from seeing the moment he realised his lies were catching up to him. Margaret ordered me a coffee anyway and made me drink it while she reviewed her notes for the afternoon session. Morrison's going to come back harder after lunch," she said. "He's going to try to shift focus back to your mental state. Make this about family dysfunction rather than fraud. Be prepared for it to get personal." I was nodding, only half listening, when I saw him. Tyler stood in the cafe doorway, scanning the room until his eyes found mine. He looked terrible, unshaven, red-eyed, his shirt wrinkled, like he'd slept in it. When our eyes met, something in his face crumpled. He walked toward our table with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and I felt my whole body tense. Margaret noticed and shifted slightly, positioning herself between us. "Paige," Tyler said, his voice hoarse. "Can I talk to you, please?" "If you're here to deliver another character assassination," I started. "I'm here to help." He pulled a USB drive from his pocket, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "I need to give this to your attorney. I should have done it weeks ago, but I was..." His voice broke. "I was scared." Margaret took the USB drive carefully, like it might be dangerous. "What's on this Mr. Warren? Emails from Melissa." Tyler's eyes filled with tears. "She found out about my gambling. I've been betting on sports for years, nothing huge, but enough that I've racked up about $30,000 in debt. My wife doesn't know. My employer definitely doesn't know. Melissa somehow figured it out. I think she hired a PI to investigate me after Paige called me for support." He sat down without being invited, his legs seeming to give out beneath him. "She sent me an email 2 weeks before the preliminary hearing. Said if I didn't write that statement about Paige being unstable, she'd send documentation of all my gambling to my wife and to my boss. I work in financial services, Paige. If they find out I have a gambling problem, I lose my license. I lose everything." I stared at my brother, this person I'd known my entire life, and saw him clearly, for maybe the first time, not the golden child, not the favourite, just a scared man who'd made terrible choices and was drowning in the consequences. "So you threw me under the bus to save yourself," I said flatly. "Yes." He didn't try to defend it. "I told myself you'd be fine, that you were strong enough to handle it, that you had resources. I told myself a lot of things to make it okay, but watching you up there today, watching Dad lie on the stand, seeing what Melissa really is..." He wiped his eyes roughly. "I can't do this anymore. I can't let you lose your home because I'm a coward." Margaret had her laptop out and was already loading the USB drive. Her expression grew more intense as she scrolled through the contents. These are extensive. Multiple emails over several weeks showing clear witness tampering and blackmail. Mr. Warren, why didn't you report this to the police?" "Because I'm an idiot," Tyler said bitterly. "Because I thought I could just play along, give her what she wanted, and she'd leave me alone. Because I was ashamed. Take your pick." "Tyler," I said, and my voice came out softer than I intended. "Did Dad know about this?" He shook his head. "I don't think so. Melissa kept it between us. She's smart that way, divide and conquer, make sure no one compares notes." He finally looked at me directly. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know you probably hate me, but I had to do the right thing even if it's way too late." Margaret's phone was already at her ear. "Judge Whitmore's clerk, this is Margaret Chen. I need to file an emergency motion to admit new evidence. It's time-sensitive and directly relevant to witness credibility." "Yes, I'll have it to you within the hour." She turned to Tyler. "I'm going to need a written statement from you explaining everything, the blackmail, the gambling, why you wrote the original statement, all of it. And you'll need to testify." "I will. Whatever you need." Tyler stood looking at me one more time. "I know you don't owe me anything, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. But I'm on your side now, for what that's worth." He left before I could respond. I sat there trying to process what had just happened. My brother, the person whose betrayal had hurt almost as much as Dad's, had just handed us evidence that could destroy Melissa's entire defense. Margaret was already typing furiously on her laptop, drafting the emergency motion. "This is huge, Paige. Witness tampering is a serious crime. If Melissa coerced Tyler into providing false testimony, it calls into question everything she said. Plus, it establishes a pattern of manipulation and fraud that supports our entire case. Will the judge allow it this late?" For something this significant? Yes, this isn't just about your property dispute anymore. This is evidence of ongoing criminal behaviour. Margaret hit send and closed her laptop. Morrison's going to lose his mind when he sees this. His whole strategy has been painting you as the unstable aggressor. Now we can prove his client has been actively committing crimes to support their case. The afternoon session felt different. Morrison seemed off balance, constantly checking his phone, probably getting updates from his team about our emergency filing. When Judge Whitmore called a brief recess to review our motion, I watched Melissa and Dad huddle together at the defence table. Melissa's mask was slipping. Her jaw was tight, her eyes hard. At 3:45 p.m, Judge Whitmore returned and granted our motion to admit Tyler's evidence. She ordered Tyler to appear for testimony at the full trial and issued a warning to the defence about witness tampering that made Morrison go pale. If I find evidence that Ms. Grant or any party associated with this case has threatened, coerced or intimidated witnesses, I will not hesitate to hold them in criminal contempt, the judge said coldly. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honour, Morrison mumbled. When court adjourned for the day, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, so was hope. Not just that I might win, but that the truth was finally undeniably coming out. Margaret and I walked to the parking garage together, both of us exhausted but satisfied. She threw her briefcase into her car and turned to me. Go home. Get some rest. We have a lot of work to do before the trial, but today was a good day. We're building an airtight case. I drove home in a daze, barely remembering the route. Mrs. Chen was in her garden when I pulled up and she waved. I waved back, feeling for the first time like maybe I wasn't completely alone in this fight. That night, I fell asleep earlier than I had in weeks, my mind finally quiet enough to rest. At 2:37 a.m, my phone rang, Margaret's name on the screen. Someone broke into my office, she said without preamble, her voice was shaking. They ransacked everything, all the file cabinets, my desk, the conference room. They were looking for something specific. My blood ran cold. The evidence, the videos, everything's backed up on secure cloud servers and I keep the original hard drives in a safe deposit box. They didn't get anything useful. But, Paige, she paused. They spray painted a message on my office wall. Drop the case, or next time it won't be the office. They were getting desperate. The police came to Margaret's office within 30 minutes of her 911 call. They took photos of the spray-painted threat, dusted for prints, filed a report. But I could tell from the officer's expression that break-ins without theft were low priority. Probably kids, I sound shy, he said, despite the targeted nature of the vandalism. We'll keep an eye out, but without security footage or witnesses. Margaret hired private security for her office the next day. She also moved all our meetings to different locations, coffee shops, her home once, even in the park, never following a predictable pattern. If they're watching, she said, I won't make it easy. But the break-in had an unintended consequence for Melissa and Dad. It proved Margaret's point about desperation. Judge Whitmore ordered both sides to preserve all evidence and authorised Margaret to request Dad's complete financial records going back 2 years as part of expanded discovery. What we found made the forgery look like child's play. Margaret's forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Patricia Liu, spent 3 weeks analysing every transaction. She called Margaret on a Tuesday afternoon, and Margaret immediately conferenced me in. You need to see this, Patricia said without preamble. Robert Warren has 3 credit cards opened in his name that show a pattern consistent with identity theft. Bank of America Chase and Citibank. Total outstanding balance, $47,300, all opened within the past 4 months, using Robert's social security number and a digital signature that matches other documents we've identified as fraudulent. Dad doesn't know about these, I asked. Based on the spending pattern, almost certainly not. The statements are going to a P.O. box that Mr. Warren doesn't own. It's rented by Melissa Grant under a business name, Grant Property Management LLC. The purchases are interesting too. luxury goods, cash advances, and several large payments to offshore accounts. This isn't someone living beyond their means. This is someone systematically draining resources and preparing to disappear. Margaret was already typing notes. This is elder financial abuse. Classic pattern. Patricia, can you trace where the offshore payments went? I'm working on it, but it's going to take time. What I can tell you is this isn't her first rodeo. I pulled public records in 3 states where Melissa Grant's previous identities showed up. Found 2 cases, one in Colorado, one in Nevada, with nearly identical patterns. Elderly men, property fraud, sudden appearance of debt victim, left holding the bag when she disappeared. The private investigator, Margaret hired a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb, confirmed Patricia's findings and added more disturbing details. Over the next week, he compiled a report that read like a criminal resume. Michelle Granger in Denver, 2008-2009, convinced. A 72-year-old widower to add her to his house title, opened credit cards in his name, disappeared with approximately $85,000. Case settled with NDA when victim's family couldn't locate her for prosecution. Melinda Davis in Las Vegas, 2012-2014, similar pattern with a 65-year-old divorced man. Property transferred credit, destroyed victim, suffered stress-induced heart attack. Melissa vanished before charges could be filed. Estimated loss £120,000. Melissa Grant in Palo Alto, 2024, present currently in progress. Target, my father. Intended victim, me. She's a professional con artist, Marcus said when he presented his findings, and she's gotten better at it over time. The early marks were sloppier, she left more evidence, made mistakes. By the time she got to your father, she'd refined the playbook. The forged signatures are better, the manipulation more sophisticated, the exit strategy more carefully planned. Margaret didn't wait. She compiled everything. Patricia's financial analysis, Marcus's investigative report, the credit card statements, the evidence of previous cons, and sent it directly to the district attorney's office with a formal criminal complaint. The DA's office called her back within 48 hours. They were opening a criminal investigation into Melissa Grant for elder financial abuse, identity theft and fraud. A detective would be assigned. Charges would likely be filed before our civil trial date. This changes everything, Margaret said. Once there's a parallel criminal investigation, Melissa's going to know she's facing serious prison time. People facing 10 to 15 years make different decisions than people facing a civil lawsuit. We decided Dad needed to know. Not out of kindness, I was still too angry for that, but because if he understood he was a victim too, he might cooperate instead of obstruct. Margaret arranged a meeting at her temporary office location, a conference room at a hotel downtown. Dad came alone. Melissa wasn't invited, though his attorney, Bradley Morrison, sat beside him looking increasingly uncomfortable as Margaret laid out the evidence. Your client has 3 credit cards he doesn't know about, Margaret said, sliding the statements across the table, totaling $47,000 in debt, all opened by Melissa Grant using his identity. She's been systematically destroying his credit while preparing to disappear with whatever she can extract from this situation. Dad picked up the statements with shaking hands. His face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally devastation. These purchases, I never authorized any of this. I never even saw these cards. Because Melissa opened them using your personal information and had the statement sent to a P.O. box she controls, Margaret continued. Mr. S. Warren, you're not just complicit in fraud against my client, you're a victim of identity theft and financial abuse yourself. This can't be right, Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept staring at the statements at purchases for designer handbags and jewellery, at cash advances totaling thousands. She said she loved me. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. If what you're saying is true, Ms. Chen, my client, may need separate representation for... Your client needs to cooperate with the criminal investigation that's about to be opened, Margaret interrupted. The district attorney is reviewing charges against Melissa Grant for elder abuse and identity theft. Mr. Warren can either be a witness or a co-defendant. I'd suggest he choose carefully. Dad looked up at me for the first time since the meeting started. His eyes were red, his face grey. I thought she loved me, he said again, and he sounded like a lost child. How could I be so blind? I wanted to feel vindicated. I wanted to say, I told you so, and watch him crumble under the weight of his own gullibility. But looking at my father in that moment, seeing him realise that the woman he'd betrayed his daughter for had been using him all along, I just felt tired and sad. She's a professional con artist, I said quietly. She's done this before, you weren't the first, and if we hadn't caught her, you wouldn't have been the last. Dad put his face in his hands and wept. 2 weeks before the trial, I got the call every daughter fears regardless of how complicated the relationship. Your father has collapsed. He's in the ICU. The call came from Stanford Hospital at 11:47 p.m. A nurse with a calm, practiced voice. Ms. Warren, your father was brought in by ambulance 2 hours ago. He's stable now, but you should come. I threw on clothes and drove to the hospital, in a fog, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. I hated him. I was suing him. He'd chosen a con artist over his own daughter and nearly destroyed everything I'd built. But he was still my father, and the thought of him dying before we could resolve anything made my chest ache in ways I didn't want to examine. The ICU was on the 4th floor, all hushed voices and antiseptic smells and machines beeping in rhythm. The attending physician, Dr. Patel, met me in the waiting area. Your father suffered a severe hypertensive crisis leading to a cardiac event, she explained. His blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels, likely due to extreme stress, and his heart couldn't handle it. We've stabilised him with medications, but the next 24 hours are critical. He's sedated right now, but you can sit with him if you'd like. Is he going to be okay? He's lucky to be alive. If the paramedics had arrived 5 minutes later. She didn't finish the sentence. Do you know what might have caused this level of stress? I thought about the criminal investigation, about Dad realising Melissa had been using him, about the trial looming in 2 weeks. A lot of things, I said quietly. They let me into his room. Dad looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the hospital bed and the tangle of wires and tubes connected to his body. His face was pale, his breathing, assisted by oxygen monitors, tracking every heartbeat. I pulled a chair beside his bed and sat down, not sure why I'd come or what I was supposed to feel. The nurse who checked his vitals was an older woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Susan. She adjusted something on one of the machines and gave me a sympathetic smile. He's been talking in his sleep, she said softly. The sedation makes some patients vocalise. Your name came up a few times. What did he say? She hesitated, like she wasn't sure she should share. Then she pulled out a small notepad. I write things down sometimes when patients are agitated. It helps us understand what's troubling them. He kept saying, Paige, I'm sorry, over and over, and then she flipped through a few pages. He mentioned someone named Linda, said she looked like Linda. I thought I could have her back. And then, I failed you. I failed your mother. My breath caught us. Linda. We thought maybe it was another daughter, but you're the only one listed in his file. Linda was his first wife. I said, the pieces clicking into place. She left him about 40 years ago before he married my mother. Susan's expression shifted to understanding. Sometimes when people are under extreme stress, old wounds surface. The heart holds onto things longer than the mind admits. After she left, I sat there watching my father breathe, and something Linda Morrison had told me in that parking lot weeks ago came rushing back, Melissa resembled Dad's first wife. That's why she'd targeted him specifically. She'd done her research, found photos somehow, maybe through social media or public records, and made herself look like a ghost from his past. Dad hadn't fallen in love with Melissa. He'd fallen in love with the memory of Linda, the woman who'd left him when he was young and broke and still had dreams. Melissa had weaponized his oldest wound, the rejection that had shaped everything that came after, including how he'd treated Mum, how he'd treated me. I reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had signed forged documents, that had practiced my signature over and over until it looked real enough to fool a county recorder. His skin was cool and dry, and I could feel his pulse fluttering weakly under my fingertips. "You're such an idiot," I whispered. "You threw away everything real, chasing something that was never coming back." He didn't answer, just kept breathing with that awful mechanical rhythm. I stayed all night. Nurses came and went, machines beeped. Dad mumbled in his sedated sleep fragments that made no sense except when they did. "Sarah, I'm sorry, not good enough, never good enough. She left me." At 6:15 a.m, his eyes opened. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, disoriented, then turned his head and saw me sitting beside him. Something passed across his face, surprise, then recognition, then shame so deep it was painful to witness. "Paige," he said, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed an hour earlier. "You came." "The hospital called?" "You should have told them to call Melissa." It came out bitter, self-directed. "She's the one I chose right, the one I destroyed my daughter for." "Melissa's probably halfway to another state by now," I said. "Once she heard about the criminal investigation, I'm guessing she started planning her exit." Dad closed his eyes. A tear ran down his temple into his hair. "I'm so stupid." "Yeah," I agreed. "You are." "She looked like Linda," he said softly. "The first time I saw her at the gym, I couldn't breathe. It was like seeing a ghost. I knew it wasn't really her, but His voice broke. "I wanted it to be. I wanted a second chance at the thing I'd lost. And I was so desperate for that, I let myself believe she actually cared about me. She didn't care about anything except your bank account and access to my house." "I know that now." More tears. "Dr. Patel told me about the credit cards, about the investigation, about everything Melissa did using my identity." He turned to look at me directly. "And I know what I did to you. The forgery, the eviction notice, all of it. I can't take it back. I can't fix it. But I can stop making it worse." "What do you mean?" He struggled to sit up, slightly wincing. "When the trial starts, I'll testify. I'll tell them everything, how Melissa coached me to forge your signature, how she planned the whole thing, how she manipulated me into going along with it. I'll tell them the truth, even though it makes me look like the pathetic old fool I am." I stared at him, searching for the trap. The angle, the way this would somehow still hurt me. But all I saw was a broken man who'd finally hit bottom. "Why now?" I asked. "What changed?" "I almost died last night," he said simply. "And when I thought I might be dying, I realized the only thing I regretted, the only thing that really mattered, was that I destroyed my relationship with my daughter for a woman who never existed. Not the real her anyway, just the ghost I'd painted over her face." When he finally woke up, the first words out of his mouth changed everything. "I'll testify against her. I'll tell them the truth." 5 months after I'd first filed the lawsuit, I walked into courtroom 4B for the final trial. September 18th had arrived with unseasonably warm weather, the kind of bright California sunshine that felt wrong for what was essentially a funeral, the death of whatever family I'd once had, the final destruction of any illusions about who my father really was. But this time, Dad wasn't sitting at the defense table. He'd withdrawn from the case entirely after his hospitalization, fired Bradley Morrison, and hired his own attorney, one who specialized in cooperating witnesses. The district attorney's criminal prosecution against Melissa was now running parallel to my civil case, and Dad was testifying for both. Melissa sat alone at the defense table with a new attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Vance, who'd taken the case pro bono probably for the publicity. Melissa looked different, smaller somehow with less polish. Her hair was darker, pulled back in a simple ponytail. No designer clothes, just a plain grey suit. She was trying to look like a victim now instead of a sophisticate. The gallery was packed. Tyler sat in the front row behind me, a silent presence of support. Mrs. Deschen was there too, clutching her journal. And in the back, I'd spotted Linda Morrison, the first wife there to watch the woman who destroyed her father face justice. Judge Whitmore called the court to order, and Margaret stood to present our case. She started with the facts, the forged signature, the fraudulent deed recording the timeline, proving I was in Boston when the document was supposedly signed. Then, she called Dad to the stand. He walked slowly, still recovering from his cardiac event, looking 10 years older than he had 6 months ago. When he raised his right hand to swear the oath, his hand shook. Margaret guided him through the testimony methodically. Yes, he'd forged my signature. Yes, Melissa had coached him. Yes, he'd known it was wrong, but convinced himself I'd understand eventually. Yes, he'd opened his home to someone who'd systematically manipulated him into committing fraud. Mr. Warren, Margaret said, why are you testifying today? Because I'm ashamed. Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I let a con artist manipulate me into betraying my own daughter. Because I'd rather face the consequences of my actions than continue living with a lie. He looked at me for the first time. I know Paige will probably never forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I can at least tell the truth. Patricia Vance tried to undermine him on cross-examination, suggesting he was only cooperating to avoid criminal charges himself, that his testimony was self-serving. But the damage was done. A father admitting to fraud against his own child was damning, no matter how you framed it. Then came the videos. Margaret had them cued on the large monitors positioned so the entire courtroom could see. The first clip showed Dad practicing my signature while Melissa coached him, make the G more looped. Perfect again. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Judge Whitmore's expression turned to stone. The second video showed Melissa on the phone discussing her con with whoever was on the other end. Once the deed is transferred and she's out the house, sells for at least $1 million. Your cut is 20% like we agreed. The third video, the one that made several people in the gallery audibly react, showed Melissa stealing Mum's ring from my jewelry box. Her voice casual and dismissive. She won't even notice. She's too busy to care about sentimental junk. I watched Melissa's face as the videos played. The mask was completely gone now. Her jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. Her hands were fisted in her lap. This was the real Melissa, cold, calculating, furious at being caught. Patricia Vance stood for cross-examination, and I could see her scrambling. Your Honour, these videos were obtained without my client's knowledge or consent. They're an invasion of privacy. They were recorded in my client's own home in common areas, which is completely legal in California, Margaret countered. Ms. Grant was a guest with no reasonable expectation of privacy in the living room or hallway. Objection overruled, Judge Whitmore said. Continue, Ms. Chen. But Vance wasn't done. When it was the defence's turn, she went on the offensive, trying to paint me as the real villain. She introduced records of a car accident I'd been in 10 years ago, a minor fender bender, where another driver had been slightly injured, fully investigated, and determined not to be my fault. Miss Warren has a history of reckless behaviour, Vance argued, and then lying about her responsibility. She's done it before and she's doing it now, falsely accusing my client to avoid admitting she willingly signed those documents, and now regrets it. It was a desperate play, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. Margaret objected, the judge sustained, but Vance kept pushing, insinuating I was mentally unstable, bringing up my therapy sessions, suggesting I'd fabricated the entire conspiracy. I sat there, hands folded, refusing to react, refusing to give her the emotional outburst she was clearly hoping for. Then, Margaret stood up with a document in her hand, and something in her expression made Melissa visibly pale. "Your Honour," Margaret said, "we have one more piece of evidence." Margaret approached the bench and handed Judge Whitmore a thick file. "This is a comprehensive report from our private investigator detailing Ms. Grant's activities over the past 15 years, including 4 documented identity changes and at least 6 separate incidents of property fraud targeting elderly men. We also have bank records showing she wired $127,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands last month, money withdrawn from credit cards fraudulently opened in Mr. Warren's name." Patricia Vance shot to her feet. "Your Honour, this is trial by ambush. This evidence was provided to Defence Counsel last week, per discovery rules," Margaret said calmly. "Ms. Vance chose not to address it in her defence." Judge Whitmore flipped through the file, her expression growing progressively darker. She looked up at Melissa, who had gone completely still, like a rabbit sensing a predator. "Ms. Grant," the judge said, "do you have anything to say about these allegations?" Melissa's attorney whispered something urgent to her, but Melissa shook her head and stood. "This is a witch hunt, Your Honour. I'm being persecuted for trying to build a life with a man I love. Everything I did was with Robert's knowledge and consent. Except Robert Warren just testified under oath that you manipulated and coerced him," Judge Whitmore interrupted. "And we have video evidence of you coaching him to forge his daughter's signature. Ms. Grant, I've been on this bench for 30 years and I've seen a lot of con artists. You're one of the most calculating I've encountered." She turned to her clerk. "I'm ready to issue my ruling." My heart hammered against my ribs as Judge Whitmore read from her prepared statement. The courtroom was completely silent except for the rustle of paper. "In the matter of Warren v. Warren, I find that the deed transfer dated March 15th was fraudulently executed through forgery and is therefore void. The property located at 847 Maple Grove Drive shall be restored to its original ownership status, with Paige Warren as sole legal owner. Robert Warren is ordered to pay plaintiff's attorney fees and court costs totaling $22,000 within 90 days. Relief flooded through me so powerfully I felt dizzy. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution of Ms. Melissa Grant on charges of forgery, elder financial abuse, identity theft, and witness tampering. Bailiff, please ensure Ms. Grant doesn't leave the courthouse before the DA's representative arrives. The bailiff moved to stand by the courtroom doors. Melissa's face had gone from pale to flushed red, her composure finally cracking. This is insane, she hissed at her attorney. I didn't do anything wrong. But her words were cut short as the courtroom doors opened and two people walked in, a man in a suit I recognised as Deputy District Attorney James Chen and a police detective. Your Honour, the DA said, we have a warrant for Ms. Grant's arrest. Everything happened quickly after that. The detective approached Melissa with handcuffs while reading her Miranda rights. Patricia Vance was protesting loudly about due process, but the warrant was valid, signed by a different judge that morning, based on the criminal investigation that had been running parallel to our civil case. Melissa Grant, you're under arrest for multiple counts of felony forgery, elder financial abuse, identity theft, and witness tampering. You have the right to remain silent. Melissa struggled as the detective cuffed her hands behind her back. This is ridiculous, Robert. Tell them I didn't. She looked wildly around the courtroom until her eyes found my father in the gallery. Robert, please. Dad looked away. They led her out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I watched through the window as they took her down the courthouse steps to a waiting police car. People on the street stopped to stare. Someone took a photo. Melissa Grant, the polished con artist who'd almost stolen everything from me, was hauled away in handcuffs like the criminal she was. The arraignment happened that afternoon in a different courtroom. Melissa was formally charged with 4 felonies. The judge set bail at $100,000 high enough that Melissa, who'd been funneling money offshore but hadn't managed to fully execute her exit plan, couldn't immediately pay it. She'd be spending at least a few nights in county jail while her attorney scrambled to raise funds. That evening, Margaret and I met with the DA's office to discuss Dad's situation. Because he'd cooperated, testified truthfully, and was demonstrably a victim of Melissa's manipulation himself, they offered a deal: probation instead of charges, conditional on him completing the repayment to me, attending mandatory counselling for 6 months, and remaining available to testify in Melissa's criminal trial. "He's getting off easy," I said flatly. "He's a 68-year-old man who had a heart attack from the stress of realising he'd been conned," the DA said, "and his testimony was crucial to securing the charges against Miss Grant. Sometimes justice isn't about maximum punishment. It's about appropriate consequences that serve the greater good." I signed off on the deal. Not because Dad deserved mercy, but because I was tired of fighting. He'd have to live with what he'd done, and that might be punishment enough. That night, I drove home to my home, legally confirmed as mine alone, and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes, just looking at it. The house I'd worked 15 years to afford. The house I'd nearly lost to fraud and family betrayal. The house that was finally, irrevocably, completely mine again. Mrs. Chen was in her garden, and she waved when she saw me. I waved back, feeling the weight of the past 6 months beginning to lift. I'd won my house back, but the hardest conversation was still ahead. Dad called 3 days after the verdict. I saw his name on my phone and almost didn't answer, my finger hovering over the decline button. But something made me pick up. "Paige," he said, and his voice was rough like he'd been crying. "Can we talk in person? Just the 2 of us?" I wanted to say no. Wanted to tell him we'd said everything that needed saying in a courtroom under oath. But I also knew that if I didn't have this conversation now, it would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Fine," I said, "but not at the house, and not alone, public place." We met at a coffee shop near Stanford campus, neutral territory, where I'd never been with him before. I arrived first, ordered a coffee I didn't drink, and sat at a corner table where I could see the door. When Dad walked in 10 minutes later, he looked like he'd aged another decade. His shoulders were slumped, his face gaunt, his clothes hanging looser than they should. He got his own coffee and sat down across from me, not saying anything at first, just staring at his hands. "Thank you for meeting me," he finally said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either." He nodded, accepting that. "I've been in therapy, court-mandated, but I would have gone anyway. My therapist says I need to take accountability without expecting anything in return. So that's what I'm trying to do." He took a shaky breath. "I was a terrible father to you, not just in the past 6 months with Melissa, but your whole life. I favoured Tyler because he was easier, because he didn't challenge me, because he reminded me of myself before life beat me down. And I resented you because you reminded me of your mother, strong, independent, not needing me. I felt unnecessary around you, and instead of being proud of your strength, I punished you for it." Tears were running down his face now, but he didn't wipe them away. "I neglected you emotionally. I made you feel invisible. And when you finally had something beautiful, this house, this life you'd built, I tried to take it from you rather than celebrate it. There's no excuse for any of it. I was selfish and cruel, and I failed you as a father in every possible way." I sat there feeling nothing at first, then everything all at once. Anger and grief and a bitter satisfaction that he finally understood what he'd done, mixed with the awful realization that his apology, while true, couldn't undo decades of damage. "Why, Melissa?" I asked quietly. "Of all the ways you could have hurt me, why that—" He closed his eyes. "Because she looked like Linda, my first wife. The one who left me when I was 28 because I was broke and had no prospects. She destroyed something in me when she walked out Paige. She made me feel worthless, unlovable, not enough, and I never got over it. Mum wasn't enough to heal that. Your mother deserved so much better than me, he said, and fresh tears came. She was kind and patient, and she tried so hard to make me happy, but I couldn't love her the way she deserved because I was still bleeding from Linda's rejection. I think Sarah knew. I think that's why she eventually left, because she realised she was trying to heal a wound that wouldn't close. So you spent 40 years chasing a ghost, I said, and when someone who looked like that ghost finally appeared, you didn't care what it cost. I didn't care what it cost me, Dad corrected. I was too stupid to realise it would cost you everything. Melissa knew exactly how to work me. She studied my history, found out about Linda, somehow made herself look like her on purpose. She played me like a violin, and I let her because I was so desperate to fix that old wound that I didn't care if it was real or not. We sat in silence for a long moment. Other people in the coffee shop chatted and laughed, living normal lives where fathers didn't betray daughters and families stayed intact. I can't forgive you, I finally said. Not yet, maybe not ever. You didn't just hurt me, you tried to destroy me. And forgiveness isn't something you earn with one apology and a few therapy sessions. I know, but I don't hate you either. And maybe someday, if you do the work, real consistent work over years, not months, maybe we can have some kind of relationship. Supervised, boundaried, nothing like before. What does that look like? He asked. You find your own place to live, immediately. You don't live with me, you don't visit unannounced, you don't make decisions about my life or my property. We can talk on the phone occasionally, maybe coffee once a month, but you have to rebuild yourself first. Go to therapy. Make amends to Tyler. Figure out who you are when you're not chasing ghosts or letting con artists run your life. And if I do all that, then maybe eventually we can be civil, maybe even friendly. But we'll never be what we could have been. You destroyed that possibility and it's not coming back. Dad nodded, slowly absorbing it. That's more than I deserve. Yes, I agreed. It is. He stood to leave but paused. For what it's worth, your mother would be so proud of you. The way you fought back, the way you didn't let us destroy you. You're everything she hoped you'd be. Don't talk about Mum like you knew her. I said, my voice sharp. You never really saw her either. He flinched but nodded. You're right. I'm sorry. I watched him walk out of the coffee shop, his shoulders hunched against a weight only he could feel. And I sat there with my cold coffee feeling something I hadn't expected. Not hatred, not even anger anymore. Just grief. Deep, aching grief for the father-daughter relationship we never had and never would have. As he walked away, I felt something unexpected. Not hatred, but grief for the father-daughter relationship we never had. That grief stayed with me for days, a dull ache that wouldn't quite fade. But alongside it came something else, the realization that I could finally move forward. The legal battle was over. Melissa was awaiting trial. Dad was in counselling and living in a rental apartment across town. And I had my house back truly, completely, legally mine. The first thing I did was change every lock. Not just the front door, but every entrance, every window latch, every possible point of access. I hired a locksmith who spent an entire day installing new deadbolts, new smart locks with codes. Only I knew new security measures that meant no one could enter without my explicit permission. When he finished and handed me the master key, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight for months. Next came the walls. Every room Melissa had touched, every paint colour she'd chosen or suggested I covered over. The living room went from her beige to a warm sage green. My bedroom, the one she'd measured windows in without permission, got repainted in deep navy. The guest suite where Dad and Melissa had stayed, I painted stark white, erasing every trace of their presence. I worked on it myself, spending weekends in paint-spattered clothes with music playing loud enough to drown out thought. There was something deeply satisfying about rolling fresh colour over the walls, covering up the past, making the space mine again in the most literal way possible. The furniture Melissa had picked out, the decorative pillows she'd bought without asking, the throw rug she'd insisted would tie the room together, the artwork she'd hung claiming she was just helping, all of it went to Goodwill. I didn't care if some of it had been expensive. I didn't care if it was perfectly good. I wanted it gone, wanted every physical reminder of her invasion removed from my home. Tyler helped with the hauling, showing up on a Saturday morning without being asked and loading his truck with donations. We worked mostly in silence. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared understanding and mutual healing. The rose garden was harder. Mum's Winchester Cathedral roses had been so damaged by Melissa's aggressive pruning and wrong watering schedule that I'd almost given up on them. But Mrs. Chen came over one morning with her gardening tools and a determined expression. "We fixed them," she said simply. "Plants are stronger than you think, like people." We worked together almost every evening after that. Mrs. Chen taught me about cane pruning, about treating the fungal infections the roses had developed from being overwatered, about patience. We amended the soil, installed proper drainage, set up a careful watering schedule that mimicked natural rain patterns. "Talk to them," Miss Chen insisted. "Plants respond to energy. Tell them you're sorry. Tell them you'll protect them now." I felt ridiculous at first talking to plants, but when Mrs. Chen wasn't looking, I found myself doing it, apologising to these roses that Mum had planted, promising I'd never let anyone hurt them again. And slowly, impossibly, they began to recover. New growth appeared healthy and green. The leaves stopped yellowing. And one morning in late October, I saw the first tiny bud forming on the main cane. I called Mrs. Chen over immediately, and we stood there looking at that bud like it was the most miraculous thing we'd ever seen. "She's coming back," Mrs. Chen said softly, and I knew she was talking about more than just the plant. My therapist, Dr. Rachel Kim, specialised in family trauma. I'd resisted therapy for years, even when I'd gone for work stress, before knowing deep down I was avoiding the real issues. But now, sitting in her warm office, with its soft lighting and comfortable chairs, I found myself finally able to talk about it all. The childhood favouritism, Mum leaving, the pattern of seeking approval from people who'd never give it. The way I'd learned to stay silent and invisible because that felt safer than risking rejection. You've spent your whole life trying to earn love from people who weren't capable of giving it, Dr. Kim said during one session. Not because you weren't worthy, but because they weren't whole. Your father was broken by his first wife leaving. Your mother was broken by your father's emotional absence, and you inherited the aftermath of their wounds. So what do? You separate your worth from their failures. You recognise that their inability to see you was about their limitations, not your value. And you build a life where your worth comes from inside, not from anyone else's approval. It sounded simple in theory. In practice, it meant challenging thought patterns I'd had for 38 years. But I showed up every week, did the work, and slowly started to believe that maybe I'd been enough all along. Mrs. Chen and I fell into a rhythm. She'd come over most evenings around 6, and we'd work in the garden together until the light faded. Sometimes we talked about her son, who'd called to apologise after the trial, made local news about her plans to reclaim her own house with the Invisible Daughters Foundation's help. But mostly we just worked in companionable silence, two women healing from family betrayal, one plant at a time. "You remind me of your mother," Mrs. Chen said one evening, her hands deep in the soil. Same quiet strength, same determination to bloom where planted even in bad soil. "Mom ran away," I said. "No, she escaped. There's a difference. And she made sure you'd have what you needed to fight when your time came." Mrs. Chen looked at me meaningfully. She knew. Sure. 3 weeks into November, I opened my mailbox to find Bill's junk mail and one envelope that made my breath catch. No return address. but the handwriting on the front, my name in careful script, was unmistakably my mother's. Then I opened the mailbox and found an envelope with no return address and my mother's handwriting. I stood frozen at the mailbox, staring at that envelope like it might disappear if I blinked. My mother had been dead for 26 years. This was impossible. But the handwriting was hers. I knew every loop and curve, had studied it in the margins of her old cookbooks and gardening journals that I'd kept all these years. My hand shook as I carried it inside, leaving the other mail scattered on the counter. I sat at my kitchen table, the one I'd refinished in the house I'd fought for, surrounded by walls I'd repainted, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter several pages folded together, and a photograph. The photo slipped out first, and I caught it before it hit the floor. Mum, maybe 30 years old, standing in a rose garden with white blooms all around her. She was smiling at the camera, really smiling, the kind of joy that comes from being somewhere you belong. I turned it over. On the back, in her handwriting, "I'm always with you, the white roses remember." I pressed the photo to my chest for a moment, breathing through the tears, then unfolded the letter. "My darling girl," it began, and I could hear her voice so clearly it was like she was sitting across from me. "If you're reading this, it means Mrs. Chen has given you this letter, which means you've proven yourself strong enough to fight for yourself. I gave this to her with specific instructions, only deliver it to Paige if she ever has to battle for the home and life she's built. I knew someone would try to take it from you. I knew because I've watched how your father operates, how he takes and takes from people who love him, how he never sees the worth in what he has until it's gone. I'm sorry I left when you were so young. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stay and fight the way you're fighting now. But Paige, I stayed silent when your father hurt me. I accepted crumbs when I deserved a feast. I made myself smaller and smaller, thinking, if I just tried harder, loved better, needed less, he'd finally see me. He never did. Don't be me. You are everything I wished I could have been: strong, independent, unafraid to take up space in the world. I see it in you, even at 12 years old. You have a spine of steel and a heart that refuses to accept less than you deserve. Never lose that. Never let anyone convince you to shrink yourself to make them comfortable. I'm leaving your father, but I'm not leaving you. Every day for the rest of my life, I will think about you. I will hope for you. I will send you every ounce of strength I have across whatever distance separates us. And I'm leaving something tangible too, something your father doesn't know about and can never touch. When you were born, I opened a trust account in your name. I've been adding to it secretly for years. $5 here, 20, their birthday money from my mother bonuses, from the part-time job your father didn't think was important. It's not a fortune, but it's yours. The account information is attached to this letter. By the time you read this, it should have grown considerably with compound interest. Use it wisely. Use it to build something beautiful. Use it to help other women who are fighting the same battles I couldn't win. Use it to prove that daughters of invisible women can become visible, powerful, unstoppable. The rose garden at the house, our house, the one on Maple Grove Drive, that I know you'll love someday. That garden is my promise to you. I planted those white roses the week before I left. Winchester Cathedral roses because they're survivors. They bloom even after harsh pruning. They come back stronger every year. They remember their roots. You are those roses, my darling. You are the part of me that survived, that grew strong, that refused to be cut down. If your father or anyone else tries to take what's yours, fight back. Not with the bitterness that consumed me, but with the strength I should have had. Fight with truth, with evidence, with the knowledge that you deserve every inch of the space you occupy in this world. I love you more than I have words for. I'm sorry I couldn't be braver, but I know you will be. Mum. I read the letter 3 times. tears streaming down my face before I noticed the additional paper clipped to the back. It was account information for California Pacific Trust, an account opened in my name in 1998 with my mother listed as trustee until I turned 25, at which point full control transferred to me. I grabbed my laptop and logged into the bank's website with the account number and access code Mum had provided. My breath caught when I saw the balance, 67 titled Mum's initial deposits, plus 26 years of compound interest, had grown into enough money to change someone's life, to start something meaningful, to help women who were fighting battles like mine, like Mrs. Chen's, like Linda Morrison's. I walked over to Mrs. Chen's house with the letter still in my hand, knocked on her door, and when she answered, I just held it up. "You knew," I said. "I've held that letter for 15 years, Mrs. Chen said, pulling me inside. "Your mother made me promise only give it to you after you'd proven you could fight and win. She said, if you never needed to fight, then you'd never need the letter. But if you did need to fight, the letter would give you what you needed for after. After winning, after the battle, when you have to figure out what to do with your victory." Mrs. Chen smiled, her eyes damp. "Your mother knew winning wasn't the end. It was the beginning." I sat in Mrs. Chen's kitchen, the same place where she'd first told me about Mum, and read her the letter. By the end, we were both crying, two women separated by decades and culture, but united by the experience of being invisible until we fought to be seen. "What will you do with the money?" Mrs. Chen asked. I looked down at the photo of Mum in the rose garden at her smile that said she had finally found peace even if she'd had to leave to find it. "I know exactly what to do with it," I said. "Something that would honour Mum and help others like us." The paperwork to establish a 501c3 nonprofit took 3 months. I worked with Margaret to draft the bylaws mission statement and legal framework for what I was calling the Invisible Daughters Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing free legal consultation and support to women facing property fraud, elder abuse, and family financial exploitation. Mum's 67 acres became the seed funding. I contributed another $30,000 odd from my own savings. Tyler, in what I think was his way of making amends, donated $10,000 and helped me set up the foundation's website and database systems. Even Dad, from his modest rental apartment, sent a check for $5,000 with a note that said simply, "For the daughters, I'm sorry." I converted the guest suite, the one Dad and Melissa had occupied, the one I'd painted white to erase their presence, into consultation offices. 2 rooms with comfortable chairs, good lighting, and walls painted in soft colours that felt safe rather than institutional. I installed a separate entrance so clients wouldn't have to walk through my personal living space. The rose garden was visible through the windows, and I'd hung Mum's photo on the wall where everyone could see it. Margaret agreed to volunteer 4 hours every Tuesday. Through her network, I recruited 3 other attorneys who specialised in real estate, law, elder law, and family law. They rotated schedules, ensuring someone with relevant expertise was available twice a week for free consultations. But the first case we took wasn't from a stranger. It was Mrs. Chen. She'd been living in that back bedroom of her own house for 20 years, her son and daughter-in-law treating her like an unwanted burden, while living off her social security checks. The house had been transferred to her son through a quitclaim deed. Mrs. Chen had been coerced into signing, told it was just paperwork for estate planning, when she'd been grieving her husband's death. "I'm 79 years old, Mrs. Chen said when she formally asked for the foundation's help. "I thought I was too old to fight, but watching you, seeing what's possible, I want my house back. I want to spend whatever time I have left in my own home making my own choices." Margaret took her case personally. We had 2 decades of documentation from Mrs. Chen's journal, proof of financial exploitation witnesses who'd seen her mistreatment. Her son tried to argue the transfer was legitimate, but the evidence of coercion was overwhelming. It took 4 months, but the judge ruled in Mrs. Chen's favour. The house was returned to her name. Her son was ordered to pay restitution for the social security checks he'd taken, and Mrs. Chen got to walk back into her home, not as a guest in a back room, but as the rightful owner. The day the verdict came down, Mrs. Chen stood in her living room, tears streaming down her face, and said, "I thought I'd die invisible. Now I get to die free." "You're not dying anytime soon," I told her. "We have too many gardens to tend." The local news picked up Miss Chen's story first. Elderly woman reclaims home after 20 years. The reporter interviewed both of us, and I mentioned the foundation explained our mission. The segment aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Women from all over the Bay Area, some from as far as Sacramento and Fresno, calling to tell their stories. A daughter whose stepmother had forged documents to steal her inheritance. A granddaughter trying to protect her grandmother from a predatory caregiver. A widow whose own children had convinced her to transfer her property for tax purposes and then tried to evict her. The stories were heartbreaking and infuriatingly similar. Women being erased, manipulated, stolen from usually by family members, usually with legal-sounding justifications, always leaving victims feeling helpless and ashamed. We couldn't help everyone. We didn't have the resources, but we helped who we could, and we referred others to attorneys who worked on sliding scales. We created a resource database of legal aid organisations, elder advocacy groups, and domestic violence services. We held monthly workshops on property rights, estate planning, and recognising financial abuse. The Mercury News ran a feature story from victim to advocate, how one woman's fight became a movement. They'd interviewed me, Mrs. Chen Linda Morrison, and 3 other women the foundation had helped. My story. Dad's betrayal, Melissa's courtroom battle became public in a way I'd never intended. I was terrified of the exposure at first, but then the messages started coming. "Thank you for speaking up. I thought I was the only one. My father tried to steal my inheritance too. Your story gave me the courage to fight back. I'm 67 years old, and my son is doing exactly what you described. I didn't know I could stop it." Within 6 months of launching, the foundation had consulted with 43 women and taken on 12 active cases. We won 8, settled 3 favourably, and had 1 still pending. Our volunteer attorney roster had grown to 7. We'd secured 2 small grants from women's advocacy organisations, and we'd been invited to present at a national conference on elder financial abuse. Mum's 67 had multiplied into something immeasurable, not just in money, but in impact and changed lives in women who'd been invisible finally being seen. I transformed my pain into purpose, just like Mum's letter had asked me to do. The white roses in the garden had bloomed magnificently, that spring fuller and healthier than they had been in years. Mrs. Chen said it was because I'd finally given them what they needed, protection, proper care, and the space to be what they were meant to be. "Just like your mother gave you," she'd added, "just like you're giving these women." 3 months later, as I was pruning the rose garden on a Saturday morning, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of cutting away dead wood to make room for new growth, someone knocked at my door. I set down my pruning shears and pulled off my gardening gloves, expecting maybe a delivery or one of the neighbours. When I opened the door, Dad stood on my porch holding a cardboard box, looking nervous and uncertain in a way I'd never seen from him before. "Hi," he said quietly. "I know I should have called first. I'm sorry for just showing up, but I have something for you and I didn't want to give it to you anywhere public. It felt too personal." I didn't invite him in. We'd had our monthly coffee 2 weeks ago at the same neutral cafe we always used, and that was enough contact for now. But I did step out onto the porch and close the door behind me, creating a physical boundary between him and my home. "What is it?" He set the box down on the porch bench. "Your mother's things. Photo albums, her journals, some jewellery, including her grandmother's locket. I hid them away after she left because looking at them hurt too much. Then I kept them hidden because I was ashamed. But they're yours. They should have been yours from the beginning. I opened the box carefully. On top was a leather-bound photo album I vaguely remembered from childhood. Underneath were 3 journals with the mum's handwriting on the covers marking different years, and wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom was a delicate gold locket on a chain tarnished with age, but still beautiful. "Thank you," I said, and meant it despite everything. "This means a lot." "There's something else you should know," Dad continued, his hands shoved in his pockets, like he didn't know what to do with them. "I've been working with the DA's office. They're prosecuting Melissa's case, and I've been helping them track down her other victims. Linda Morrison put me in touch with 2 other men, one in Colorado, one in Nevada, who went through similar schemes. We're all testifying. Between my cooperation, the video evidence you collected, and the testimony from her previous victims, the DA thinks she's looking at 15 to 20 years. "Good," I said flatly. "She tried to contact me from jail," Dad said. "Wanted me to post her bail, told me she loved me, said everything was a misunderstanding. I didn't respond. I finally understand what she is, Paige, and what I let myself become by going along with it." He looked older than his 68 years worn down by consequences he'd finally stopped running from. But there was something different in his eyes too, a clarity that hadn't been there before. "I'm still in therapy," he continued. "Twice a week now, not just the court-mandated sessions. I'm working on understanding why I've spent 40 years chasing ghosts instead of appreciating what was real. Dr. Martinez says I have an avoidant attachment style stemming from Linda's abandonment, and I've been recreating that trauma pattern in every relationship since. It's..." He stopped, shook his head. "I'm not making excuses. I'm just trying to understand so I can be better." "That's good, Dad," I said, and I meant that too. I wanted him to heal, to become someone who could build healthy relationships, even if those relationships weren't with me. "I know we have boundaries," he said. "Monthly coffee, nothing more. And I respect that. But I want you to know I'm not asking you to change those boundaries or forgive me faster or anything like that. I just wanted to give you Mum's things and tell you..." His voice caught. "I'm proud of what you're doing with the foundation. Your mother would be so proud. You're helping people she never got to help, fighting battles she couldn't fight. You're everything good that came from our family, despite me, not because of me." Shows. I looked at this man who'd hurt me so deeply, who'd chosen so poorly, who'd nearly destroyed everything I'd built. And I realised something that Dr. Kim had been trying to tell me for months. I could acknowledge his growth without forgetting his failures. I could wish him well without letting him back into my life. I could hold both truths at once, that he was my father, and that he'd forfeited the right to be more than a distant, supervised presence in my life. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him, "and I'm glad you're doing the work. But nothing changes between us. We have our boundaries, and they're staying where they are." "I understand," he said, and he seemed to really mean it. "I won't ask for more than you're willing to give." He walked back to his car, and I carried the box inside, setting it on the kitchen counter, to look through later when I had the emotional bandwidth. Then, I washed my hands, put my gardening gloves back on, and returned to the roses. I was deadheading a particularly enthusiastic bloom when I heard the doorbell ring again. This time, it was a young woman, maybe 25, with red-rimmed eyes and a folder clutched to her chest. "Are you Paige Warren?" she asked. "From the Invisible Daughters Foundation." "I am." "I saw your interview in the newspaper. I read about Mrs. Chen's case, and I..." Her voice broke. "My father died 6 months ago. He was sick for a long time, and my stepmother took care of him. But after he died, I found out she'd gotten him to change his will while he was on heavy pain medication. The house my mum bought before she died, the house Dad always said would be mine, my stepmother is claiming it's all hers now. She's trying to evict me from my own childhood home. I saw myself in her desperate eyes in the way she held that folder, like it contained her entire life. I saw Mrs. Chen Linda Morrison, my mother, all of us, the invisible daughters fighting to be seen. "Come in," I said, gesturing toward the foundation entrance. "Let's sit in the garden. You can tell me everything and we'll figure out what to do." I led her through to the backyard where the roses were blooming. The Winchester cathedrals had fully recovered from Melissa's damage, and they were spectacular white blooms opening to the sun, strong and healthy and thriving. The young woman sat in the chair across from me, and I pulled out a legal pad to start documenting her case. "You've come to the right place," I told her. "I've been exactly where you are, and I'm going to help you fight." As she talked, telling me about her father's illness and her stepmother's manipulation and the documents she didn't understand, I glanced up at the roses. A breeze moved through the garden, and the white blooms swayed gently like they were nodding approval. Mum would have loved this. Loved seeing her daughter use pain as fertilizer to grow something beautiful. Loved knowing that the house she'd dreamed of me having, the one she'd planted roses in before she had to leave, had become a sanctuary not just for me, but for others like us. For the first time in my life, I looked at this house and felt what I'd never felt before. This is mine. I fought for it. I earned it. And I'm finally home. As I sit here in my garden watching the white roses bloom exactly where my mother planted them 26 years ago, I can't help but think about how many women are out there right now sitting in houses that should be theirs, watching someone else slowly take control of their lives. How many daughters are being told they're dramatic, oversensitive, ungrateful, when really they're just trying to hold on to what they've earned. This story didn't end the way most people expected. There was no fairy tale reconciliation with my father. Melissa didn't have some dramatic redemption arc where she saw the error of her ways. The truth is, real life is messier and more complicated than that. My father is in therapy twice a week, genuinely working on himself, trying to understand the patterns that led him to betray his own daughter. But we'll never have the close relationship we might have had if he'd chosen differently. We have coffee once a month at a neutral location we're civil, and that's enough. Maybe that's all it will ever be, and I've made peace with that. Melissa is serving a 15-year sentence in a California state prison. The DA's office told me she tried to negotiate a plea deal multiple times, each attempt more desperate than the last. She wanted to blame my father, then claimed she was mentally ill, then said she was the real victim. None of it worked. The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear, the victims too numerous. She'll be almost 70 when she gets out if she serves her full sentence. I don't spend much time thinking about her anymore. She was a predator who chose me as prey, and she lost. That's all the space she deserves in my mind now. But this story didn't end with just me getting my house back. It ended with something so much bigger than I ever imagined. The Invisible Daughters Foundation has helped 78 women in its first year and a half. 78 women who walked through my door thinking they were alone, thinking they were crazy, thinking their own family members had every right to take what was theirs. We've won or favourably settled 42 cases. 42 homes returned to their rightful owners. 42 women who learned they had the right to fight back. Mrs. Chen finally sleeps in her own bedroom instead of that cramped back room. She's replanted her entire garden and hosts tea for the foundation volunteers every month. She tells everyone who'll listen that she wasted 20 years being invisible, but she's not wasting another day. Last month, her son came to her door to apologise. She listened, thanked him for coming, and told him she'd think about it. Then, she closed the door and went back to her life. That's power. The foundation has expanded beyond what I dreamed possible. We now offer support groups, financial literacy workshops, and a network of volunteer attorneys across 5 counties. We've been featured in 3 national publications. Other cities have reached out asking how to replicate our model, and every single week, more women find us, tell us their stories, and learn they don't have to accept being erased. I want you to understand something important. If you're watching this, and any part of my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if someone has tried to take what's yours and convinced you that you were imagining the theft, if you've been called too sensitive, too dramatic, too difficult when really you were just asking to be treated with basic dignity and respect, you are not crazy, you are not wrong, you are not alone, and you absolutely have the right to fight back. Your worth is not determined by whether your family recognizes it. Your accomplishments are valid even if no one in your family celebrates them. Your boundaries matter even when people call you selfish for maintaining them. And your property, your home, your life, your peace, they belong to you. No one gets to take them simply because they share your DNA or because you once loved them. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think differently about your own situation, or reminded you of someone who needs to hear this message, I'm asking you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. These stories about women fighting back and refusing to be invisible need to reach the people who need them most, and the algorithm doesn't always favour difficult truths about family dysfunction. Second, share this video with someone who needs it. You might not even know you're saving someone's life by sending them this link. And third, leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Have you ever had to fight to be seen in your own family? Have you ever had to set boundaries with people who believed they were entitled to more? What would you have done in my situation? I read every single comment, and I promise you, your story matters. When other women see that they're not the only ones who've experienced this, it gives them courage they didn't know they had. We're building a community here of women who refuse to be invisible anymore. Join us. The white roses bloom stronger every year. They survived the damage and came back more beautiful than before. You can too.